My name is Daniel, and this happened on my very first night working security. It was the kind of job nobody really talks about. Night security in an old warehouse district near the edge of town. Quiet work, long hours, mostly sitting in a small office and walking the building every hour or so. At least, that's what the manager told me. I took the job because I needed money. Nothing more complicated than that. Rent was late, my car needed repairs, and this was the only place that called me back after I applied. The building sat far away from the busy part of the city. Old shipping warehouses lined the road like giant gray boxes, each one with faded numbers painted above the loading docks. Most of them had been empty for years. Mine was called Warehouse 14. I remember the first time I saw it that evening. It was already getting dark when I pulled into the cracked parking lot. The building looked bigger than I expected. 3 stories tall, made of old concrete walls that had turned almost black with age. The windows were dusty, and most of them were broken. Nothing about it looked alive. But the strangest thing was the silence. No traffic, no people, just wind moving across the empty yard and rattling a loose sheet of metal somewhere near the roof. I parked beside a small guard office near the front gate. Inside, the office smelled like dust and old paper. A metal desk sat against the wall with a few monitors showing security cameras. Most of the screens showed empty hallways or dark corners of the warehouse. A man named Carl was waiting there for me. He was the day guard. Carl looked like he had worked there too long. Tired eyes, gray beard, slow voice. He shook my hand and gave me a small ring of keys. "Pretty easy job," he said. "Just walk the building every hour, check the doors, make sure nobody sneaks in." I nodded. He pointed toward the monitors. "Cameras still work in most areas. Some are dead, though." Then he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. "One more thing," he said. I waited. Carl pointed at one of the monitors. The screen showed the second floor, a long hallway with several small office rooms. At the end of the hall, one doorway was glowing. A light was on inside. "That room," Carl said quietly. "What about it?" I asked. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "That light comes on sometimes." I frowned. "Motion sensor." He shook his head slowly. "Power's shut off to that floor." I laughed a little because I thought he was joking. But Carl didn't laugh. "Electric company cut power to the upper offices 2 years ago," he said. "Too expensive to keep it running." I looked back at the monitor. The light in the office was steady, not flickering, just glowing like a normal lamp. "So how is it on?" I asked. Carl shrugged. "No idea." Then he stood up and grabbed his jacket. "Anyway, don't worry about it." He walked toward the door. "If it's on when you do your patrol, just ignore it." I watched him leave the office. The sound of his truck faded down the road until everything became quiet again. That was the moment my shift truly started. And suddenly, the building felt a lot bigger. For the first hour, nothing happened. I sat in the chair watching the camera monitors. Most of the screens showed empty storage floors filled with old pallets and broken crates. Some cameras showed loading docks covered in dust. Everything looked frozen in time. At exactly 10:00 p.m., I grabbed a flashlight and started my first patrol. The warehouse was colder than I expected. The air smelled like old wood and rusted metal. My footsteps echoed across the huge concrete floor. The first floor was mostly empty, just wide open space where shipping containers used to be stored. My flashlight beam moved across the walls and ceiling as I walked. Everything looked normal. Still, silent. When I reached the stairwell leading to the second floor, I remembered the monitor. The glowing office. I told myself, it was probably just a faulty wire or leftover power in the system. Still, I felt a strange hesitation as I climbed the stairs. The metal steps creaked under my boots. Each sound echoed through the empty building. When I reached the second-floor hallway, I saw it immediately. The light. It was exactly where the camera showed it. At the very end of the hall. A soft yellow glow spilling from the open office doorway. The rest of the hallway was dark. I walked slowly toward it. Each step felt louder than the last. Halfway down the hallway, I stopped and listened. Nothing. Just silence. No voices. No movement. When I reached the office door, I shined my flashlight inside. The room was small. A dusty desk. An old chair. Stacks of empty boxes. And sitting on the desk, a single desk lamp. It was on. The bulb glowed softly, lighting the room in warm yellow light. I stepped inside. The strange thing was, the lamp didn't look old. Everything else in the room was covered in dust, but the lamp looked clean, like someone had used it recently. I bent down and looked behind the desk. The lamp's cord ran across the desk and down to the wall. I followed it with my eyes. The cord wasn't plugged into anything. It just hung there loosely, disconnected. I stared at it for a long time. My brain kept trying to explain it. Maybe a battery lamp. Maybe hidden wiring. But nothing made sense. Slowly, I reached out and touched the lamp. It was warm. Not just warm from the bulb. Warm like it had been turned on recently. That feeling ran down my spine. I turned the lamp off. The click sounded very loud in the quiet room. The light disappeared instantly. The office went dark. For a moment, I stood there with only my flashlight. Then I walked out and continued my patrol. I finished checking the rest of the building without seeing anything strange. When I returned to the guard office, I sat down and looked at the camera monitors. The second-floor hallway appeared on one screen. The office was dark, exactly the way I left it. I relaxed a little. Maybe Carl was just messing with me. Maybe it really was nothing. I watched the screens for another hour. Around midnight, I leaned back in the chair and stretched. Then something on the monitor caught my eye. The hallway camera. The second floor. The office. The light was on again. I sat up straight. Slowly, very slowly, the desk lamp inside the room began to glow brighter. Like someone had just switched it on. But I knew something Carl hadn't told me. Something I realized the moment I saw that light again. I was the only person in the building. And I had the only keys. I remember the exact moment. The second night started to feel different. At first, everything seemed normal. At least, normal for a building that had been empty for years. The desk lamp on the second floor had turned itself on again after I shut it off. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit, but I told myself there had to be a simple reason. Old wiring, some kind of backup power, maybe even something Carl forgot to mention. By 1 a.m, the warehouse had settled into the deep silence that only empty places seem to have. It's hard to explain that kind of quiet. It isn't just the absence of sound. It feels heavier than that, like the air itself is holding its breath. I was sitting in the guard chair watching the monitors when I noticed something strange. Not movement, just stillness. The cameras showed long empty hallways, rows of metal shelves, and the wide open shipping floor. Every corner looked the same as it had all night. But the longer I watched, the more the building began to feel different. Like it had woken up. At 2 a.m, I started my next patrol. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I stepped onto the warehouse floor. The concrete stretched out in front of me like a gray ocean. My boots made dull echoes that bounced off the high ceiling. Each step sounded loud. Too loud. I walked past stacks of old wooden pallets and broken crates that had been left behind when the company shut down. Dust covered everything. The place smelled like old cardboard and rust. For the first few minutes, nothing felt unusual. Then I heard it. Another footstep. It was faint. A soft sound somewhere behind me. At first, I thought it was just my own echo. When you walk through a building this big, the sound of your boots can bounce around the walls in strange ways. So I stopped walking. The warehouse went silent again. I waited. Nothing. I told myself it was just the echo. That explanation felt good enough, so I kept moving. My flashlight passed over a row of tall metal shelves as I crossed the center of the floor. Step, 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 and then I heard it again. Another step. Not in front of me. Not beside me. Behind me. I stopped walking instantly. The silence rushed back in. Slowly, I turned around and shined the flashlight across the floor behind me. The beam moved across empty concrete. Pallets, dust, nothing else. No one was there. I stood still for a moment, listening carefully. The building was quiet again. I exhaled slowly and rubbed the back of my neck. "You're just tired," I muttered to myself. Night shifts do strange things to your head. After a few hours of silence, your brain starts filling in the empty space. That was the explanation I chose. So I kept walking. I made my way toward the loading docks along the far wall. Tall metal doors lined the building, each one big enough for a truck trailer to back into. Most of them were locked with thick chains. As I passed Dock 7, the wind outside pushed against the loose metal panels on the roof. The sound echoed through the warehouse like distant thunder. I paused for a moment and looked up. The roof was high above me. Shadows filled the steel beams and catwalks. For a second, I thought I saw something move up there. But when I focused the flashlight higher, there was nothing. Just darkness. I shook my head and continued my patrol. That's when the footsteps came back. This time they were clearer. One step, then another. Slow, heavy. They sounded exactly like someone walking across the concrete floor. And they were definitely behind me. I stopped again. The footsteps stopped too. The silence returned immediately. It was so sudden, it made the hair on my arms stand up. I turned around quickly and scanned the entire warehouse with the flashlight. Nothing moved. The beam passed over crates, shelves, and empty floor. No one. Not even a shadow shifting. I stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly. My brain started running through possibilities. Maybe someone had broken in. Maybe there was another guard Carl forgot to mention. Maybe someone was hiding somewhere in the building. That idea felt more realistic than footsteps appearing out of nowhere. So I decided to test something. Instead of continuing forward, I turned around and started walking back the way I had come. My boots echoed again as I crossed the open floor. Step, step, step. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of my own movement. Then it happened again. Another step. Behind me. Perfectly timed. Like someone was walking a few feet back, matching my pace. My stomach tightened. I stopped. The other step stopped too. The silence came back instantly. I didn't turn around right away. I just stood there, staring at the long, empty space ahead of me. My heartbeat sounded louder than my breathing. Slowly, I turned my head and looked over my shoulder. The flashlight beam, moved across the floor behind me. Still nothing. No movement. No person. Just the empty warehouse. I felt a strange coldness crawl up my back. Not fear exactly. More like confusion. Because the sound had been real. I knew what footsteps sounded like on concrete. And those weren't echoes. To calm myself down, I decided to check the security cameras again. Maybe they would show something I missed. Maybe someone really had entered the building. The walk back to the guard office felt longer this time. Every step seemed heavier. And every few seconds, I thought I heard that faint second step again. But whenever I stopped, the sound vanished. When I reached the office, I locked the door behind me. Then I sat down and pulled the camera screens closer. One by one, I checked each camera feed. Warehouse floor, storage aisles, loading docks, hallways. Everything looked empty. Then I noticed something that made my chest tight. The camera that showed the warehouse floor, the same area I had just walked through, was completely still. No movement. No second person. Just me, walking alone across the concrete. But something about the video bothered me. I leaned closer to the screen. My own footsteps were clearly visible. Each time my boot hit the floor, I could see the movement. But the sound I had heard, the second set of steps, they didn't match anything on the camera. No shadow, no person, nothing following me. And yet, I knew what I had heard. I stared at the monitor for a long time, trying to understand it. Finally, I leaned back in the chair and rubbed my eyes. Just your imagination, I whispered to myself. That explanation felt thin now, but it was still the only one I had. About 10 minutes later, I glanced back up at the camera screens. And that's when I noticed something else. The camera facing the second floor hallway. At the end of the hall, the office light was glowing again. Soft and yellow. Exactly the same as before. But this time something felt different. Because as I stared at the screen, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest, I heard it again. A slow, heavy footstep. Somewhere out on the warehouse floor. And this time, I hadn't even left the office. After hearing that step outside the guard office, I sat very still for a long time. At first I thought it might have been the building settling. Old places make strange sounds at night. Pipes expand, metal shifts, wind moves through cracks you cannot see. But this sound had been different. It had weight to it. A slow step on concrete. And it had come from the warehouse floor, while I was inside the office watching the cameras. I leaned forward and looked at the monitor again. The wide camera facing the warehouse floor showed nothing moving. The empty space stretched across the screen just like before. Rows of dusty pallets, long shadows, no one walking there. Still, the uneasy feeling in my chest would not go away. My eyes slowly drifted back to the second floor camera, the hallway, and the office at the end. That light was still glowing, soft and steady, the same warm yellow color I had seen earlier. I stared at it for a while, hoping maybe it would flicker and shut off by itself. But it didn't. The room stayed lit, quiet, waiting. Eventually I sighed and stood up from the chair. I knew what I had to do. Part of the job was checking the building. If something strange was happening upstairs, I couldn't just sit there pretending not to notice it. I grabbed the flashlight again and unlocked the office door. The warehouse air felt colder when I stepped outside. The silence had returned, thick and heavy like before. For a moment, I stood there listening. No footsteps, no movement, just the distant sound of wind brushing against the outside walls. I began walking toward the stairwell. My boots echoed softly across the floor. Step, step, step. This time I listened carefully after each step, waiting for that second sound to follow me. But nothing came. The building stayed quiet. When I reached the metal stairs, I paused at the bottom. The stairwell was narrow and dark. My flashlight beam climbed the steps ahead of me, reflecting off the metal railing. For some reason, I suddenly remembered what Carl had said earlier that evening. If the light's on, just ignore it. At the time, that advice seemed strange. Now it felt like a warning. But I had already come this far. So I started climbing. Each step creaked under my weight. The sound echoed up the stairwell and faded into the darkness above. When I reached the second floor, the hallway stretched out in front of me again. Long, quiet. The office light glowed at the far end just like before. Only this time, something about it felt wrong. I cannot explain exactly what I mean. The light looked normal. The hallway looked normal. But the air felt heavier. Like the building was watching me. I started walking slowly down the hallway. My flashlight stayed pointed at the floor ahead of me. I didn't want to look directly at the office yet. The beam slid across cracked tiles and scattered dust. Halfway down the hall, I stopped. I listened carefully. Still nothing. The building was silent again. After a few seconds, I continued walking. The office door was open when I reached it. The same dusty desk sat in the middle of the room. The same old chair. The same stacks of empty boxes. And the same desk lamp glowing softly on the desk. Just like before. For a moment, I stood in the doorway without moving. The warm yellow light spilled across the floor and touched my boots. It almost looked inviting. But something deep inside me didn't want to step inside that room again. I forced myself to move forward anyway. The air inside the office felt warmer than the hallway. Not by much, but enough to notice. My flashlight swept slowly across the room. Everything looked exactly the same as it had earlier. The dusty boxes, the peeling paint on the walls, the desk lamp glowing quietly. I stepped closer to the desk. The lamp's cord still hung loosely over the edge, still not plugged into anything. I reached out again and touched the lamp. Warm, just like before. The warmth made my stomach tighten. Someone or something had turned it on again. But this time, something else caught my attention. I glanced down at the desk surface. The dust pattern looked strange. Earlier, the desk had been covered in a thin layer of gray dust. But now, there were marks in it. Long streaks, as if something had been dragged across the surface. Slowly, my throat felt dry. I leaned closer to examine the marks. They were not random. They looked almost like finger trails, 5 thin lines moving through the dust, leading toward the edge of the desk. I followed them with my eyes. They stopped right where the lamp cord hung down. For a moment, I just stood there staring at those marks. Then something even stranger occurred to me. I slowly turned and looked at the wall behind the desk. The outlet where the lamp should have been plugged in. But the outlet wasn't there. I blinked, confused. I moved the flashlight closer to the wall. The paint was smooth, unbroken. There was no outlet, no wiring, nothing, just an empty wall. That didn't make sense. I was certain the lamp cord had been hanging beside an outlet earlier. I had looked directly at it, but now the wall looked like it had never held one at all. A cold feeling crept into my chest. Slowly, I backed away from the desk. My flashlight moved across the room again. And that's when I noticed something that made my breath stop. The far wall of the office looked wrong. The paint color was slightly different from the rest of the hallway walls. Like a patch. A large patch. My mind began piecing things together in a way I didn't like. I stepped back into the hallway and shined the flashlight along the outside wall. The hallway continued for another 20 feet past the office doorway. But something about the spacing felt strange. I walked slowly down the hall, counting my steps. Then I turned around and walked back. The distance didn't add up. The office room should have been bigger than the space available between the walls. My heartbeat started to pick up. I stepped back into the office and turned in a slow circle. The room felt smaller now, tighter, like it had been squeezed into a space where it didn't belong. And then a quiet thought formed in my mind. A simple one. What if this room wasn't supposed to be here anymore? I suddenly remembered something Carl had mentioned during the interview days earlier. He had said the second floor used to have several offices before the company closed. But later, parts of the building had been renovated. Walls removed. Rooms demolished. I walked quickly back into the hallway and looked again at the patch in the wall paint. A large rectangular section, slightly newer than the rest. It looked exactly like a place where a doorway had been sealed shut. My chest felt tight as I turned back toward the office. The light was still glowing. Soft, calm, but the thought in my head would not go away. If the building had been renovated, if the offices had been demolished, then there was only one explanation that made sense. This room, this office with the glowing lamp, it shouldn't exist anymore. And yet I was standing inside it. I stared at the lamp again. The warm light hummed softly in the silent room. Then something moved. Not the lamp, not the desk, something else. The dust on the floor near the doorway. A faint new mark appeared, like the beginning of a footprint. Right behind me. The job sounded simple when I first heard about it. Just a temporary night shift, 3 nights a week, sit in a small guard booth and walk the building every hour. Nothing complicated. No real responsibility except making sure nobody broke in. The pay was better than most night jobs in town, which should have been my first warning. But when you're low on money, you don't question things too much. The warehouse sat on the far edge of the industrial district, about 20 minutes outside town. The road that led there passed empty factories, silent rail tracks, and long stretches of weeds growing through broken pavement. The place used to be a meat distribution center years ago. Trucks would arrive every morning, bringing frozen beef and pork to be shipped across the state. That was before the company shut down, before people stopped wanting anything to do with the building. I didn't know much about that part when I accepted the job. All I knew was that the security company needed someone to fill in while their regular guard was on medical leave. 3 weeks of work. That was the deal. When I arrived on my first night, the sky was already dark. My headlights swept across the front of the building as I pulled into the cracked parking lot. The warehouse looked enormous. A wide concrete structure with tall loading docks and faded company logos still painted on the walls. Most of the letters had peeled away with time. The wind moved slowly through the empty lot, carrying a faint smell that reminded me of old metal and something colder, something stale. I parked beside the small guard booth near the front gate. The booth looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The windows were cloudy with dust, and the metal door groaned when I opened it. Inside was a simple desk, an old chair, and a small set of security monitors mounted on the wall. The monitors showed different parts of the warehouse. Empty loading docks, long storage corridors, a few dim hallways near the offices. Everything looked quiet. Too quiet. A man named Victor was waiting inside when I stepped in. He was the day guard who would be leaving once my shift started. Victor was older, maybe in his late 50s, thin shoulders, gray hair that stuck out from under a faded cap. He didn't smile when he saw me. Instead, he studied me for a moment like he was trying to decide something. "You the new guy?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, "temporary guard." He nodded slowly. "Right." Victor stood up from the chair and stretched his back. "Pretty easy job," he said. "Just walk the building every hour, check the doors, make sure nobody's messing around inside." His voice sounded calm, but there was something else in it too. Something careful. I set my bag down beside the desk and looked at the monitors again. "How long's this place been closed?" I asked. Victor shrugged. 7, maybe 8 years now. "That long?" He nodded. Company went under, trucks stopped coming, everyone moved on. I noticed one of the monitors showing a long hallway with metal doors along both sides. The lighting looked dim and yellow. "What's down there?" I asked. "Cold storage," Victor replied. "Freezers." I stared at the screen for a moment. The hallway looked endless. Cold. Empty. Victor grabbed a ring of keys from the desk and handed them to me. "You'll need these for the doors during patrols." The keys were heavier than I expected. Old steel keys with scratched labels. As I clipped them to my belt, I noticed Victor watching me again. "You ever worked security before?" he asked. "A few warehouses," I said. "Nothing like this, though." He let out a quiet breath. Then he looked toward the monitors again. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Finally, he spoke. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "There's a reason this job pays more than the others." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" Victor rubbed the side of his neck. "Most guards don't last long here." I waited for him to explain, but he didn't right away. Instead, he walked to the door of the booth and looked out toward the dark warehouse yard. "Place makes people uneasy," he continued. "Too quiet, too empty." "That's most abandoned places," I said. Victor shook his head slowly. "No, this one's different." The wind pushed softly against the booth windows. I felt a small chill run across my arms. "What happened here?" I asked. Victor hesitated. "Accident," he said finally. "Years ago." "What kind of accident?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked back to the desk and tapped one of the monitors with his finger. The screen showed the cold storage hallway again. "Worker went missing," he said quietly. I frowned. "Missing?" Victor nodded. "Night shift guy, cleaning crew." "What happened to him?" Victor stared at the screen for a few seconds. "They never found him." The words hung in the small booth for a moment. "That's strange," I said. Victor shrugged. Building was shut down not long after that. Company said it was financial reasons. He paused. "People around here think otherwise." I didn't respond. Part of me assumed it was just one of those old workplace stories that get passed around after something bad happens. Every big building seems to have one. Victor grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. "My shift over," he said. "You'll be fine." He opened the door, then stopped before stepping outside. "One more thing," he added. I waited. "If you hear anything in the freezer hallway during your patrol." His voice trailed off. "What?" I asked. Victor looked back at me. His expression was calm, but his eyes looked tired. "Just don't open the last door." I stared at him. "Why?" Victor gave a small shake of his head. "Just trust me." Then he stepped out into the night, and closed the booth door behind him. I watched through the window as he walked to his truck and drove away. Soon the sound of the engine disappeared down the road. And just like that, I was alone with the warehouse. For the first hour, nothing happened. I sat in the chair watching the monitors while the wind moved across the empty yard outside. Every camera showed the same thing: dusty floors, empty hallways, silent rooms. But the longer I sat there, the more the building started to feel strange. Not haunted, not threatening, just wrong somehow. Like it was waiting. Around midnight, I grabbed the flashlight and started my first patrol. The metal door of the booth creaked as I stepped outside. The cold air hit my face immediately. The warehouse entrance stood open ahead of me, a wide doorway leading into darkness. I clicked on the flashlight and stepped inside. The smell changed right away. Cold, damp, and faintly something older. Something that reminded me of a place that had once held meat for a very long time. My footsteps echoed across the concrete floor as I moved deeper into the building. Rows of empty hooks still hung from metal rails in the ceiling. Some of them swayed slightly when the wind pushed through the vents. I followed the path shown on the patrol map until I reached the hallway Victor had pointed out earlier. The cold storage corridor. The temperature dropped immediately when I stepped inside. The hallway stretched far into the distance. Metal freezer doors lined both sides. Heavy doors with thick handles and faded warning labels. My flashlight moved slowly across them as I walked. Door 1, Door 2, Door 3. Each one closed, each one silent. And somewhere far down the hallway, almost too quiet to notice at first, I thought I heard something. A faint sound, like scratching, coming from the very last freezer door. The first time I heard the scratching, I thought it was just the building. Old places make strange noises when the temperature drops at night. Metal contracts, pipes shift, small animals find their way inside walls. So when that faint sound came from the end of the freezer hallway, I tried not to think too much about it. Still, I stopped walking. The cold storage corridor felt much quieter than the rest of the warehouse. The air was colder here, and every sound seemed to travel farther along the metal walls. I held my flashlight steady and listened. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Just the low hum of the old ventilation system somewhere above the ceiling. Then it came again. A faint scraping sound. Soft, slow, like something dragging across metal. My stomach tightened a little. The sound was coming from the far end of the hallway, from the last freezer door. I remembered what Victor had said before he left. If you hear anything in the freezer hallway, just don't open the last door. At the time, his words felt like one of those old workplace stories people tell to scare new guards. But now, standing there in the cold corridor, the memory made the air feel heavier. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe a loose vent. Maybe a rat trapped inside the wall. This building had been closed for years. It wouldn't be strange if animals had found their way inside. That thought helped a little. So I started walking again. The flashlight beam moved slowly across the metal doors as I passed them. Door 4, Door 5, Door 6. Each one was sealed with a thick latch and a heavy padlock. Dust covered the handles. It didn't look like anyone had opened them in a very long time. The scratching sound came again. A little clearer this time. Still slow. Still faint. But definitely real. I stopped again about 10 feet from the last door. The corridor felt colder here. My breath came out in thin clouds as I exhaled. The last freezer door stood at the end of the hallway like a wall of steel. It was bigger than the others, heavier, a thick chain wrapped around the handle, secured by a large rusted lock. The warning label on the door had faded so badly I could barely read it. I stood there listening carefully. For a moment, the hallway returned to silence. Then the scratching came again. This time it sounded closer, right behind the metal door. My grip tightened around the flashlight. The sound wasn't loud, but it had a pattern to it. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause, slow and careful, like something testing the surface of the door. A strange chill moved down my back. I took another step closer. My boots echoed softly against the concrete floor. When I stopped in front of the door, the scratching stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt thick. I stood there for a while, staring at the steel surface. The door looked solid, cold, completely still. The chain around the handle had a layer of dust on it that looked untouched. No sign that anyone had been there recently. Probably a rat, I whispered to myself. My voice sounded small in the long corridor. I leaned slightly closer to the door. The metal smelled cold and old. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, very slowly, the scratching returned, right on the other side. This time it sounded closer to where my face was. The noise was faint, but I could feel the vibration through the metal. Scratch, scratch, pause. My heart began beating faster. Rats don't usually scratch like that. Their movements are quicker, messier. This sound felt slow, careful, almost deliberate. Without thinking, I raised my hand and knocked softly on the door. The sound echoed down the hallway. The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed was deeper than before. I waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Nothing came from the other side. The freezer door remained completely still. I felt slightly foolish standing there. See, I said quietly to myself. Nothing. Maybe the noise had been pipes behind the wall. Maybe the vibration of my footsteps had traveled through the metal panels. There were 100 possible explanations. I turned around and started walking back down the corridor. My flashlight beam slid across the doors again as I moved away. Door 6. Door 5. Door 4. The scratching returned. I froze in place. The sound had started again the moment I turned my back. Slow, faint, and once again coming from the last freezer door. I slowly looked over my shoulder. The door stood exactly where I had left it. The chain hung motionless, but the scratching continued. Scratch, pause, scratch. This time it sounded different. Not on the center of the door. Lower, closer to the floor. A strange thought crossed my mind. What if something was trying to dig its way out? I shook my head immediately. That idea made no sense. The door was solid industrial steel. Nothing inside could scratch its way through that. Still, the sound continued. Slow, persistent. I walked back toward the door again. As soon as I reached it, the scratching stopped. Just like before, the silence returned instantly. My chest felt tight now. It was too consistent to be random. The sound only happened when I moved away. Almost like something on the other side didn't want me standing there. I bent down slightly and aimed the flashlight at the bottom of the door. The steel surface near the floor was covered in faint marks. Thin lines scratched into the metal. At first, I thought they were just old damage. But when I looked closer, the pattern became clearer. They looked like claw marks. long narrow grooves running across the steel. Dozens of them. Maybe more. My stomach turned. Those marks hadn't been made by rats. They were too deep. Too wide. Slowly I stood back up. The corridor felt colder than before. The air seemed to press against my chest as I breathed. I remembered Victor's words again. Just don't open the last door. For the first time that night, I felt a strong urge to leave the hallway immediately. So I did. I turned around and walked back toward the main warehouse floor. The scratching sound did not follow me. The rest of the patrol passed quietly. No more strange noises. No movement on the cameras. By the time I returned to the guard booth, the sky outside had started turning pale with early morning light. I sat down in the chair and stared at the monitors. My mind kept drifting back to the freezer door. The sound, the claw marks, the way the scratching always stopped when I stood in front of it. Eventually, the sun began to rise. A little after 7, Victor returned to start his shift. He stepped into the booth and nodded at me. "Quiet night?" he asked. I hesitated. Then I told him about the scratching. Victor didn't look surprised. He just leaned against the desk and listened. When I finished, he sighed quietly. "Yeah," he said. "That happens." I stared at him. "What do you mean it happens?" Victor looked toward the cold storage camera on the monitor. "The last freezer," he said. "You hear it sometimes." I waited for him to explain more. But he didn't. Instead, he rubbed his eyes and spoke in a tired voice. "The strange part isn't the scratching." I felt a small knot form in my chest. "Then what is?" I asked. Victor looked back at me. "The strange part." He paused for a moment. "Is that freezer hasn't had power in over 10 years. He nodded slowly toward the monitor again. "And it's still locked from the outside. I didn't sleep much after that first night. The scratching sound stayed in my head the entire drive home. Even when I tried to distract myself with the radio, the memory of that slow scraping noise kept coming back. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. It was the pattern that bothered me the most. It didn't sound random. It didn't sound like an animal trapped inside a wall. It sounded patient. That afternoon, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Old buildings always have strange noises. Pipes shift, metal contracts, wind moves through broken vents. But the marks on the freezer door were harder to explain. Those long scratches carved into the steel. I kept seeing them in my mind. By the time evening came around, I had already decided I was going to look into the history of the place before my next shift. The warehouse had once been a big employer in town. Hundreds of workers came through there over the years. If something strange had happened inside, there had to be some kind of record. So before heading back to work, I stopped at the small public library near the center of town. It wasn't a big building, just a quiet place with rows of computers and old newspaper archives. The woman at the front desk barely looked up when I walked in. I sat down at one of the computers and typed the name of the old meat distribution company into the search bar. Several old articles appeared right away. Most of them talked about the business closing down, financial problems, layoffs, trucks being sold off. But one article caught my attention immediately. The headline was short. "Night worker reported missing at local distribution plant." My chest tightened slightly as I clicked on it. The article was dated 12 years ago. According to the report, a maintenance worker named Luis Ortega had been assigned to the night cleaning crew inside the cold storage section of the warehouse. It was a normal shift. Nothing unusual had been reported. But sometime during the early morning hours, Luis had disappeared. The article said his coworkers noticed he was missing when they finished their rounds around 3 in the morning. At first they assumed he had stepped outside for a break. But when he didn't return, they started searching the building. They checked the offices, the loading docks, the storage floors. No sign of him anywhere. Eventually someone contacted the police. The article said officers searched the building for several hours. But Luis Ortega was never found. No witnesses. No evidence of foul play. No signs that he had even left the building. The story ended there. Just a short piece about a missing worker and a worried family. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the screen. My mind slowly connected the details. Night shift worker, cold storage area, disappeared sometime around 3 in the morning. I glanced at the time in the corner of the computer screen. It was almost 6 in the evening now. My shift would start again in a couple of hours. For a moment, I thought about closing the browser and leaving it at that. But something told me there had to be more to the story. So I searched again. This time I typed the worker's name. More results appeared. Most of them were older articles written during the search efforts. Police interviews, statements from family members. But one detail appeared again and again in those reports. Luis Ortega had last been seen walking down the cold storage hallway toward the freezer rooms. I felt that same cold feeling return to my chest. The last freezer door, the one with the chain, the one Victor had told me not to open. I scrolled through another article. This one had been written a few weeks after the disappearance. Police had searched every room inside the building, including the freezer units. But the final freezer door had already been sealed shut during the investigation. According to the report, there had been a malfunction in that particular unit days before Luis disappeared. Something wrong with the cooling system. The company had shut it down and chained the door while repairs were scheduled. But the repairs never happened. The company closed down soon after. The freezer stayed sealed. The article ended with a short sentence that made my stomach tighten. There is no evidence Luis Ortega ever left the building. I sat quietly for a while after reading that. The library around me was silent. Outside, the sun was beginning to disappear behind the buildings. Eventually, I closed the browser and drove to work. The warehouse looked even darker than it had the night before. The sky above the industrial district had turned deep blue by the time I pulled into the lot. Victor was already inside the guard booth when I walked in. He nodded when he saw me. "You came back," he said. "Temporary job," I replied. He studied my face for a moment. Then he asked, "You hear the scratching again last night after you left?" "No," I said, "but I looked something up today." Victor didn't look surprised. "What'd you find?" "A worker went missing here," I said quietly. "Luis Ortega." Victor leaned back in his chair. "Yeah," he said. "I remember that. You knew about it." He nodded slowly. "Everyone who's worked security here knows the story." I hesitated before asking the next question. The last freezer door, was that the one he was near? Victor didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the monitor showing the cold storage hallway. Then he nodded. "Yeah." I felt a chill pass through me. "So the freezer's been sealed ever since?" Victor nodded again. "Locked, chained. For over 10 years. We sat in silence for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me since the library. "Victor, what time did Luis disappear?" Victor looked at the clock on the wall. Then he spoke quietly. "About 3 in the morning." My eyes moved slowly toward the cold storage camera on the monitor. The long hallway looked empty. Still, cold. Victor followed my gaze. Then he spoke again. "That scratching you heard." He paused. "Did it start around 3?" I thought back carefully. The memory came back clearly. The cold hallway. The steel door. The faint sound behind it. It had been just after 3 in the morning. I nodded slowly. Victor didn't say anything after that. The rest of the booth remained silent. Around midnight, I started my patrol again. The warehouse floor was quiet as always. My flashlight beam moved across the empty space, while my boots echoed against the concrete. Everything looked normal, until I reached the cold storage hallway. The air felt colder there. The long corridor stretched out in front of me. The freezer doors stood silent along both sides. I walked slowly toward the end. Door 4. Door 5. Door 6. Finally, the last door came into view. The heavy steel surface. The chain wrapped tightly around the handle. The rusted lock holding it closed. I stopped about 10 feet away. The hallway was silent. My eyes moved to the small clock on my watch. 2:58 a.m. I stood there listening. The seconds passed slowly. 2:59. The cold air pressed against my skin. Then the clock turned to 3:00. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the other side of the freezer door, the scratching began again. Slow, faint, and exactly the same as the night before. I used to think night shifts were peaceful. That's the word people use when they've never actually worked one. Peaceful, quiet, easy. But the truth is, night shifts have a different kind of silence. The kind that slowly crawls into your head after a few hours. The kind that makes you notice things you would never pay attention to during the day. Small sounds, strange shadows, movements that might not even be real. I started working the overnight dispatcher job at the cargo yard about 6 months after the place shut down. Most of the trucking company had moved their operations to another city, but they still kept the property for storage. A few trailers were left behind, old paperwork, equipment nobody had bothered to move yet. My job was simple. Sit in the dispatch office from 10 at night until sunrise. Watch the yard cameras, and make sure nobody broke in. The warehouse itself sat in the middle of a huge empty lot surrounded by a tall chain-link fence. Behind the building were 14 loading docks where trucks used to back in every day. Dock 1 through Dock 11 were close to the office side. Dock 12 through Dock 14 sat farther down the building, near the edge of the property where the fence met an old rail line. Most nights were the same. Nothing happened. I would sit at the desk, drink coffee, and watch the security monitors while the wind moved through the empty yard. The first strange thing I noticed happened sometime in early October. I remember the date because the nights had just started getting colder. Around 1 in the morning, I was looking at the row of camera screens when I saw something odd on the monitor for Dock 12. At first, it looked like a shadow. Just a darker patch, moving slowly across the pavement near the loading bay. I leaned closer to the screen. The camera showed the back wall of the warehouse and the empty space where trucks used to park. Nothing was there, but the shadow moved again. It slid across the ground for a second, then stopped. I stared at the screen for a while. After a moment, I convinced myself it was probably just the wind pushing loose trash around the yard. That happened all the time. Plastic bags, pieces of cardboard, old paper blowing across the pavement. Still, something about the movement didn't feel right. So I grabbed the logbook we used for the night shift and wrote a quick note. 1:12 a.m. Possible movement near Dock 12. That was the first entry. After that, I kept watching the monitor. But nothing else happened for the rest of the night. The next shift was quiet too. Then 2 nights later, it happened again. This time I noticed it a little after 2 in the morning. The Dock 12 camera flickered slightly, and then something moved across the frame. Not fast. Slow. Almost like someone walking through the edge of the camera's view. I sat up straight in the chair. The yard outside the office windows was completely still. No headlights. No trucks. The gate at the front of the property was locked. Yet the monitor clearly showed movement. I rewound the recording and watched the footage again. The camera quality wasn't great, but I could see it clearly. A dark shape passing slowly across the pavement, then disappearing out of frame. It was too tall to be trash blowing in the wind, too steady to be a loose piece of plastic. It looked more like a person. I wrote another note in the logbook. 2:07 a.m. Movement again near Dock 12. Possible trespasser. After that, I watched the yard cameras for the rest of the night. Nothing else appeared. By morning, the strange moment already felt less important. But the pattern kept repeating. Every few nights, something moved near Dock 12. Always after midnight. Always slow. And always gone by the time I checked the camera a second time. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. One night, around 1:30, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside the dispatch office to check the yard myself. The cold air hit my face immediately. The sky above the warehouse was dark and empty, with only a few faint stars showing through the clouds. I walked across the gravel lot toward the back of the building. My boots crunched softly with each step. The warehouse wall stretched beside me like a long concrete cliff. When I reached Dock 11, I stopped for a moment and looked down toward Dock 12. The area was empty. The loading bay door sat halfway open like it had been left that way years ago. Old tire marks still stained the pavement where trucks used to back into the dock. Everything looked still. Quiet. I walked a little closer. The flashlight beam moved across the ground and the metal dock ramp. Nothing. No footprints. No trash. No sign that anyone had been there. I stood there listening for a moment. The wind moved through the yard with a soft, hollow sound. Somewhere far off, a train horn echoed through the night. But nothing else moved near Dock 12. Eventually, I went back inside the office. I told myself the camera must have been glitching. Old security systems do that sometimes. But the entries in my logbook kept growing. Movement near Dock 12. Movement again. Possible figure near loading bay. Each time the same thing happened. A shadow. A slow shape crossing the pavement. Then nothing. About 2 weeks after the first entry, I noticed something else. This time it wasn't the camera. It was the dock itself. I had stepped outside again during a quiet shift, mostly just to stretch my legs. When I reached Dock 12, I noticed fresh tire marks on the ground. They weren't there the night before. Long black arcs across the pavement. The kind trucks leave when they reverse toward a loading bay. I stared at them for a long time. No trucks had entered the yard in months. The gate was locked, and the office camera pointed directly at the entrance. Still, the marks looked recent. Very recent. I knelt down and ran my fingers across the pavement. The rubber felt rough and dark, not faded like the older tire marks nearby. Fresh. I stood up slowly and looked toward the loading dock. The empty bay door stared back at me. Cold. Dark. and silent. That was the moment I decided to start documenting everything more carefully. Every movement, every sound, every strange thing that happened near Dock 12. Because something was definitely happening out there in the yard. And whatever it was, it kept coming back. After a while, the quiet parts of the night start to blur together. When you sit in the same room for hours, watching the same cameras, drinking the same stale coffee, your mind begins to drift. Small things start to stand out more than they should. For me, it was Dock 12. At first, it had just been a shadow crossing the camera view, something small enough that I could explain it away. But once I started writing everything down in the logbook, the pattern became harder to ignore. The movements always happened late, usually sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning. And they always happened in the same place. Dock 12. For about a week, nothing new appeared. The cameras stayed quiet, the yard stayed empty, and I started thinking maybe the whole thing had been nothing more than camera glitches. Old systems do that sometimes. A little electrical interference, a little wind shaking the pole, and suddenly the image shifts enough to make it look like something moved. That explanation worked for me, at least until the night I saw the truck. It was around 2:15 in the morning. I remember because I had just poured another cup of coffee and sat back down at the desk. The dispatch office was dim except for the glow of the monitors. Outside the windows, the yard looked like a flat ocean of darkness. I was halfway through filling out the hourly patrol report when something moved on one of the screens. The Dock 12 camera. At first, I thought it was another shadow. But this time, the movement was different. Slow, heavy. I leaned closer to the monitor. The camera faced the row of loading docks along the back wall of the warehouse. Most of the space in front of them was empty pavement. But now, something was entering the frame. A truck. An old delivery truck. The kind companies used 10 or 15 years ago, before everything switched to newer models. It rolled slowly across the camera view, its dark shape moving through the dim yellow security light above the dock. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. My brain struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. No trucks were supposed to be there. The company had moved all operations months ago, and the gate to the yard was locked. I pushed my chair closer to the desk. The truck kept moving. It turned slowly and began backing toward Dock 12. The movement was steady and controlled, just like a real delivery. But something about it looked wrong. The headlights were off. The cab looked empty. No driver. At least none that I could see through the grainy camera image. I watched as the truck lined itself up with the dock. Then very slowly, it reversed into place. The metal bumper stopped just inches from the loading ramp. And then it sat there. Still, my heart had started beating faster now. I grabbed the logbook and quickly wrote down the time. 2:16 a.m. Truck seen backing into Dock 12. Even as I wrote the words, they didn't feel real. I stood up and walked to the office window. From there, I could see part of the yard outside. But Dock 12 was too far down the building to view directly from the office. All I could see was darkness. I went back to the monitors. The truck was still there, parked perfectly against the dock. I waited for the driver to step out. No one did. The truck simply remained in place. Minutes passed. The camera showed no movement. Finally, I decided to check the gate camera. If a truck had entered the yard, it would have passed through the front entrance. The gate monitor showed exactly what I expected. Nothing. The heavy metal gate was still closed. The chain and lock hung exactly where they always did. No sign that anyone had opened it. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. I switched back to the Dock 12 camera. The truck was gone. Just like that. One moment it had been parked at the dock. The next moment the space was empty again. I stared at the screen, confused. I rewound the camera footage. The recording played back slowly. The yard appeared empty at first. Then the truck entered the frame again. It rolled toward the dock, backed into place, stopped. But when the recording reached the moment where the truck had disappeared, the footage glitched. The screen flickered, and suddenly the dock was empty again. No truck leaving. No truck driving away. Just gone. I replayed the clip 3 more times. Each time the same thing happened. The truck arrived, backed in, and then the image skipped forward to an empty dock. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. That didn't make any sense. Even if the camera had glitched, the truck still had to physically leave the yard. But the gate camera showed nothing. No movement. No headlights. No vehicle entering or exiting. For the rest of the night, I kept checking the Dock 12 camera. Nothing else appeared. The pavement stayed empty. The dock stayed quiet. By the time morning came, the whole thing felt like some kind of strange dream. But the footage was still there, saved in the system, and the entry in my logbook was still written in my own handwriting. The next night, I decided to watch the Dock 12 camera more carefully. I didn't leave the desk. I didn't patrol the yard. I just sat there and waited. The clock on the wall ticked slowly toward 2 in the morning. The warehouse around me stayed silent. Finally, at exactly 2:16, the truck appeared again. It rolled into the camera, view the same way it had the night before. Slow, silent, no headlights, no visible driver. My chest tightened as I watched. The truck turned carefully and began backing toward the dock. Just like before. Same angle, same movement. It slid into position against Dock 12 and stopped. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the camera flickered. The screen jumped, and the truck was gone again. I checked the gate camera immediately. Still locked. Still empty. No trucks anywhere in the yard. That was the moment I realized something was seriously wrong. Because whatever that truck was, it wasn't entering the yard, and it wasn't leaving either. It was only appearing in one place, Dock 12, and somehow, it was arriving every single night. By the 3rd week of my night shifts, Dock 12 had started to feel different from the rest of the yard. It's hard to explain that feeling unless you've spent long hours in a quiet place. After a while, you begin to know every corner of it, every sound, every shadow. And Dock 12 was the only place that kept changing. The truck kept appearing on the cameras every night at the same time. 2:16 in the morning. Always the same old delivery truck, the same slow turn into the loading lane, the same careful reverse toward the dock, and always the same ending. The camera would flicker for a second. Then the truck would be gone. No arrival at the gate. No exit from the yard. Just an empty loading bay again. After watching it happen for several nights in a row, I started to feel less curious and more uneasy. At first I tried telling myself it was some kind of technical problem. Maybe the recording system was replaying old footage. Maybe the camera software had glitched. But the strange thing was, the rest of the yard cameras worked perfectly. Only Dock 12 ever showed the truck. And only at that exact time. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. One night, I decided that instead of just watching the monitor, I was going to see the dock for myself when the truck appeared. That shift started like any other. Cold air outside. The quiet hum of the security monitors inside the dispatch office. I poured myself a cup of coffee and waited. The clock slowly moved past midnight. Then 1. Then 2. At 2:10, I grabbed my flashlight. I stepped outside the office and started walking along the side of the warehouse toward the loading docks. The gravel under my boots made soft crunching sounds as I moved through the darkness. Above me, the sky was cloudy and dim. The only light came from the old security lamps mounted along the back wall of the building. When I reached Dock 10, I stopped. Dock 12 was just ahead. The loading bay sat in shadow, the half-open door creating a long black rectangle against the wall. The pavement in front of it was empty. I checked my watch. 2:14 a.m. I walked a little closer and stood near Dock 11. From there, I had a clear view of the loading area. The wind moved softly through the yard. Nothing else made a sound. 2:15. I looked toward the entrance gate far across the lot. Still locked. Still silent. Then something moved. At first, it was just a shape in the darkness. Then the truck rolled slowly into view. My breath caught in my throat. Seeing it on the camera had been strange enough, but seeing it with my own eyes felt completely different. The truck moved quietly across the pavement, its large dark shape gliding through the dim yellow light above the docks. Just like on the recordings, the headlights were off. The engine made no sound, and as far as I could tell, there was no driver. I stood perfectly still as it turned toward Dock 12. The truck moved with slow precision, lining itself up with the loading bay. Then it began revering. The tires rolled silently across the ground. The trailer slid back toward the dock. Closer, closer, until the bumper stopped just inches from the metal ramp. The truck settled into place. Then everything went still again. The engine remained silent. No doors opened. No driver stepped out. I felt the cold air pressing against my skin as I stood there watching. A strange heaviness settled in my chest. Part of me wanted to walk back to the office right then. But another part of me needed to know what was inside that trailer. So I walked closer. Each step felt louder than the last in the quiet yard. When I reached Dock 12, I stopped beside the trailer. Up close, the truck looked even older than I expected. Rust covered the edges of the metal panels. The company logo on the side had faded almost completely away. The back doors of the trailer were closed, but not locked. I could see the metal latch hanging loosely against the door. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I climbed up onto the loading ramp. The metal surface groaned slightly under my weight. I stood there listening. The truck remained silent. The trailer door stood only a few feet away. I reached out and pulled the latch open. The sound echoed softly across the yard. Then I slowly opened the door. Cold air drifted out from inside the trailer. The darkness inside looked thick and deep. I raised my flashlight and aimed the beam into the trailer. The interior looked empty at first. Bare metal walls. Dust covering the floor. No crates. No cargo. Just an empty trailer. I took one step inside. My boots echoed softly on the metal floor. The air smelled old, like something that had been sealed away for a very long time. I moved the flashlight beam across the walls. Still nothing. Just emptiness. Then the light reached the far end of the trailer, and I saw something standing there. A shape. Tall. Still. At first, I thought it might be a stack of old equipment. But then the shape shifted slightly. My heart skipped a beat. It was a person, or something shaped like one. a dark figure standing near the back wall of the trailer. I couldn't see any details. The flashlight beam seemed to fade before it reached the figure's face. It just stood there, perfectly still, watching. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The silence inside the trailer felt heavy. Finally, I spoke. "Hello." My voice sounded thin in the metal space. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a slow step backward. The movement was quiet, almost smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. I felt a cold wave of unease move through my chest. "Hey," I said again. Still no response. The figure took another step backward, then another. Each movement carried it deeper into the darkness at the far end of the trailer. My flashlight beam tried to follow it, but the shadows seemed to swallow the light before it reached that corner. Soon the shape became harder to see, just a darker patch inside the darkness. Then it stepped back once more and disappeared completely. I stood there frozen, staring into the empty space. The trailer was silent again. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. Slowly I walked toward the back. My flashlight swept across the metal walls. The space was empty, completely empty. No person, no hiding place, no door leading out. Just solid metal panels on every side. A strange chill crawled up my spine. I turned around slowly and looked back toward the open trailer doors. The loading dock lights outside glowed faintly through the opening. For a moment, I just stood there trying to understand what I had seen. Then, somewhere behind me, in the dark corner of the trailer, I heard a quiet sound. A slow step, moving deeper into the darkness, even though there was nowhere left to go. I remember the first time I actually opened the warehouse's old filing room. It was during one of the quiet nights when nothing moved outside, the kind of silence that presses in from all sides, where even your own breathing feels loud. I had been keeping a careful log of the Dock 12 activity, the truck that appeared like clockwork every night, and now I needed context. I needed history. I needed to understand how an empty yard could produce something that looked alive. The filing room was small, tucked behind the dispatch office. The door creaked when I opened it, a long, hollow sound that bounced down the narrow hallway. Inside, rows of metal cabinets stood like soldiers in formation, each drawer heavy with dust and time. I pulled open the first drawer. Folders packed with shipping records, invoices, and employee logs stared back at me. Yellowed paper, some crumbling at the edges. Everything smelled of old paper and stale air. I began flipping through the files, starting with shipments around Dock 12, just to see what had gone on there before the company moved. It wasn't long before I found something that made my stomach tighten. A folder labeled Accident Report Dock 12 sat at the very back. I pulled it out carefully and opened the top sheet. My flashlight flicked across the document, revealing a typed report dated nearly 15 years ago. The report described a fatal accident. A delivery truck, an old model, much like the one that appeared nightly, had backed into the loading dock during an early morning shift. The driver, a man named Carl Renner, had been crushed between the truck and the dock ramp. The accident was quick, sudden, and catastrophic. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but he did not survive. The file included statements from witnesses, forklift operators, night staff, a few security guards who had been on duty. They all described the accident in careful, restrained language. Words like unfortunate, tragic, and sudden filled the pages. I swallowed hard. The truck I had been watching every night, the one that appeared and disappeared without a trace, was identical to the one in the report. The same model, same color scheme, same faded logo on the side. I closed my eyes for a second and pictured the vehicle backing into Dock 12. The cold metal of the ramp, the echo of the engine, the scream of the hydraulic lift as it hit the body. That horrible, final moment frozen in time. But that wasn't the part that terrified me most. It was that the nightly deliveries had never stopped. I flipped through more of the shipping logs. Year after year, the records were almost empty, except for the notation, Dock 12 delivery completed, always stamped at 2:16 in the morning, the exact same time I had been watching on the security monitors. Every night, every year, every night I had been sitting at that desk, watching the old truck arrive back into Dock 12 and vanish without a trace. But the deliveries had ceased decades ago. There had been no new cargo, no drivers, no shipments, and certainly no functioning company at that location. It didn't make sense, and yet the records were clear. Each stamp of completion was signed in careful penmanship, as though the deliveries were still happening. I sat back in my chair, letting the log folder slide to the floor. My mind felt heavy, weighed down by the impossible pattern. I could see it all in my head. The truck rolling silently into the yard, no engine noise, no driver, just the vehicle moving as if it had a will of its own, backing into the dock every single night, obeying some invisible schedule. I leaned closer to the window and looked out at the empty yard. The wind rattled the chain-link fence, and the distant glow of a street lamp painted long, slanted shadows across the pavement. I couldn't shake the thought that somehow, somewhere, the accident had created a loop, a repetition frozen in time, replaying silently behind my eyes every night. A shadow of movement caught my attention. I looked down at Dock 12. Of course, nothing was there. The pavement was empty, the dock was still, silent. But I knew better now. It wasn't nothing, it was never nothing. I imagined Carl Renner or someone like him trapped in that final moment. Perhaps the truck carried the echo of that tragedy like a phantom, replaying it endlessly. And every night, just as I watched, the ghostly vehicle returned to Dock 12, obeying the same motions, backing in, performing the delivery that should have ended long ago. I wanted to leave the folder there, put the records back in the drawer, and tell myself it was over, that the past didn't reach into the present. But the warehouse had other ideas. Every night after that, I would see it again. The truck arriving at 2:16, backing into Dock 12, leaving no evidence, no explanation. The same slow, mechanical precision. The same emptiness inside the trailer. Sometimes I wondered if anyone else could see it. Other night staff, security officers, drivers. But the more I asked around, the more I realized everyone avoided that dock after dark. Like Dock 12 itself had been cursed. I began to notice little things. A subtle coldness near the dock steps, a whisper of wind that never reached the rest of the yard, the faint creak of metal moving when the truck appeared. Small signs, easily dismissed during the day, but impossible to ignore in the dead of night. The warehouse seemed alive in that way only abandoned places can be, aware of who stood where, reacting to presence, holding onto memory. And Dock 12 held the memory of that fatal accident as if it were sacred. Every delivery that never happened, every truck that should not exist, every shadow inside the trailer, all of it traced back to a single moment of human life lost. A moment frozen, repeating endlessly like a tape stuck in the darkness. I started timing my patrols to watch it arrive, noting every subtle shift of shadows and light, every echo of a movement that had no origin. The first time I stepped closer, I swore I saw a dark shape move inside the trailer, a silhouette at the far end, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. And then it disappeared, melting into the darkness as if it had never existed. The truck, the dock, the trailer, the empty records, they all combined into a single truth I could not deny. The warehouse remembered. It remembered the night of Carl Renner's death. It remembered the delivery that should never have been completed. And somehow, inexplicably, it repeated it every single night. I could feel it when I stepped inside the yard. Cold, persistent, watching. The deliveries were endless. The truck was eternal. And Dock 12 would never be empty again. I never thought I'd be working nights in a place like this. The warehouse was massive, stretching farther than my eyes could reach. Rows upon rows of metal shelves, all coated in a thick layer of dust. The air smelled of old cardboard, rust, and something faintly sour like forgotten food. I'd walked through plenty of empty warehouses before, but this one felt different, heavy, silent in a way that made the silence almost touch you. I had taken the job on a temporary basis. Nights only, inventory work, count the shelves, record what was there, check for damage. Simple, straightforward work. The pay was decent and it kept my schedule open for the daytime. I told myself it was just a night shift, nothing more. The first time I stepped inside, I froze for a moment. The doors were huge, steel, and swung open with a groan that echoed all the way to the far end of the warehouse. Dust motes floated in the streams of light from the few bare bulbs that hung overhead. I felt tiny in the cavernous space. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking down the nearest aisle. My boots crunched softly on the concrete floor. Each shelf was packed with boxes, some labeled, some not. Paper records, tools, random equipment, everything piled in a haphazard way, like no one had worked here for years. I could hear my own breathing. It sounded louder than it should. The walls swallowed any other noise, and I felt a little shiver run through me. I told myself it was just the cold. The building hadn't been heated in ages. I began my inventory, scanning the shelves with the flashlight. I moved slowly, reading labels, jotting notes into my notebook, box after box, aisle after aisle. Hours passed and the silence never changed. No distant traffic, no hum of machinery, just the quiet I'd never experienced anywhere else. After a while, I realized the warehouse had its own rhythm. Small creaks from the metal shelves settling, a faint whistle of wind through cracks in the roof, the occasional drip of water from somewhere above. Nothing loud, nothing sudden, but enough to remind me that I was alone, completely alone in this enormous space. Somewhere in the back, I noticed shadows stretching long across the floor, cast by the flickering light above. They shifted when I moved my flashlight. I paused and listened. Nothing. My pulse quickened a little. I told myself it was just my eyes adjusting. I continued down the aisles. Some shelves were so high I couldn't see the top. Boxes leaned slightly as if they were about to fall, but never did. Dust fell from the edges when I touched a few of them. I sneezed quietly. The sound felt loud. I reminded myself, stay calm, just an inventory job. After a couple of hours, I reached the far end of the warehouse. The aisles here were narrower. The shelves were taller, and the darkness between them seemed thicker. I shone the flashlight down the row and saw the faint outlines of boxes stacked irregularly. Something about the shadows in that aisle made my stomach tighten. I paused to breathe. For a moment I thought I saw movement. A box seemed to shift slightly. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight directly on it. Nothing. Just an old crate, dusty and still. My heart was beating faster than it should. I told myself it was probably the wind. Old buildings do that. Shifts in air can move things ever so slightly. I moved on, trying to keep my pace calm, controlled. My mind was alert, though, noticing every small sound, every faint echo, every shadow that didn't seem to belong. As I worked, I started noticing patterns in the warehouse. Some sections were colder than others. Some had a slight smell of mildew, almost rotten, and some areas seemed heavier. The air felt thicker there, as if it pressed against me when I walked through. By the third hour, I had covered nearly half the warehouse. The notes in my notebook were getting longer. I wrote detailed descriptions. Shelf numbers, box contents, odd smells, small anomalies. I told myself it was just careful work, nothing more. But deep down, I felt a creeping sense that this warehouse wasn't just empty. I paused again, looking down an aisle that led toward the far wall. The darkness there seemed complete. The flashlight barely cut through it. My eyes tried to adjust, but the shadows swallowed everything. I swear I felt something watching me from that end. Not seeing me directly, but the sense of a presence. It was subtle at first, like a weight in the back of my mind. Then stronger, pressing closer as I stood frozen. I took a deep breath and told myself it was impossible. There was nobody here. I'm alone. Just boxes, shelves, and empty concrete. I started moving again, trying to ignore the sensation, but the warehouse seemed to hum around me. Not with sound, but with tension. Every step I took echoed. Every movement of the flashlight created shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. By the time I reached the middle section again, I felt my pace slowing. I tried to stay methodical, checking every box, marking every note. But something about the building made my hands shake slightly. My mind kept wandering to the dark end of the aisle I had passed. I kept imagining shapes moving just out of sight. The top of a box tilting slightly, shadows crossing where there should be none, a faint rustle that couldn't be explained. I told myself it was fatigue. I was tired from the day, and this was a long night. My mind was playing tricks. The warehouse was just an empty building. That was all. Still, I found myself glancing back down the aisles I had already checked, half expecting something. Hours passed. My flashlight was running low on battery. The silence pressed in like a living thing. I marked the last row of boxes in my notebook and sat down for a moment on the edge of the metal shelving. The floor creaked softly under my weight. I heard the faint whistle of the wind outside. My own heartbeat sounded loud in my ears. And then, from somewhere deep in the shadows, I heard it. A soft scrape, like metal against metal, faint, distant, yet unmistakable. I froze. The sound didn't repeat. It didn't move closer. But I knew it had come from the end of the aisle, the farthest point I had just passed. I swallowed hard and told myself it was nothing, just the warehouse settling, just a box shifting. But the feeling didn't go away, that subtle pressure in the air, that sense of being watched. I finished my last round quickly, marking every note in my logbook. By the time I left the warehouse, the first hints of dawn were in the sky, gray and muted. Walking out, I looked back at the long rows of shelves stretching into shadow. The building seemed heavier than when I had entered, silent but not empty. And I knew, deep down, that my first night in the warehouse wasn't just work. Something had noticed me. Something had watched me. I didn't know it then, but that was only the beginning. By the second night, I had started to feel like I knew the warehouse. Every aisle, every shelf, every shadowed corner. I walked through the rows more confidently now, notebook in hand, flashlight cutting narrow paths through the darkness. Yet even with familiarity, there was a sense that the building wasn't quite empty. I started on my usual rounds around midnight. The lights overhead flickered intermittently, throwing uneven pools of illumination along the metal shelves. Dust motes floated lazily in the flashlight beam, drifting through the air like tiny ghosts. My boots echoed softly on the concrete floor as I moved down aisle A, checking boxes, counting crates. Nothing unusual at first. The shelves were the same as yesterday, dusty, neglected, stacked with forgotten inventory. But as I approached aisle C, I felt it again, the strange pressure in the air that had unsettled me the first night. It wasn't a sound yet, not really. Just a feeling as though something was waiting in the shadows, hidden behind the towering shelves. I paused. The flashlight cut a thin circle of light across the metal racks. The aisles on either side stretched into darkness. Somewhere deep in aisle C, a faint draft shifted across the floor. The smell of old cardboard and dust became sharper, almost pungent. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was nothing, just the building settling. Then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, distant, carried along the rows of shelving. My name. James. I froze mid-step, gripping the flashlight tightly. My ears strained to catch the sound again. The whisper was faint, like it came from far away, deep in the shadows. "James." My stomach tightened. My first instinct was to convince myself it was my imagination. Empty warehouses play tricks on you, they say. Wind in the cracks, pipes settling, air moving through the old structure. I took a slow breath and told myself it was nothing. I moved forward cautiously, shining the flashlight down aisle C. The light cut through the darkness but revealed nothing beyond the racks of boxes. No figure, no movement, just endless shadows. The whispering stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the warehouse in a suffocating silence. I whispered back, my voice barely audible, "Hello." Nothing, just my own breath and the soft hum of the lights above. I tried to shake it off and continued down the aisle, counting boxes, checking inventory. But the feeling lingered. The shadows seemed thicker here. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. Then again I heard it. "James." This time it was closer, clearer, like someone was standing just out of view, barely visible in the darkness between the shelves. I stopped, gripping the flashlight tighter. My mind raced. There shouldn't be anyone here. The warehouse was abandoned. My only job was inventory. There were no coworkers, no visitors, no one, just me. I stepped slowly into the aisle, the light scanning each shelf. Empty. Boxes stacked haphazardly, some leaning, some dusty, some crumpled. No sound but my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. "James." It was louder now, closer. The whisper seemed to float along the metal racks, moving toward me. I tried to locate it, swinging the flashlight in a wide arc. Nothing. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. I tried to convince myself it was some acoustic trick. The shape of the warehouse, the rows of shelves, the emptiness. Sound travels strangely in places like this. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something aware, something that knew my name. I took another step forward. The flashlight illuminated more of the shadows, but there was still nothing. I paused, listening. The warehouse felt alive in the dark, watching. Every creak of metal, every shift of air, every distant echo seemed deliberate, controlled. Then the whisper again, this time from directly behind me. "James." I spun around. Nothing, empty shelves, shadows stretching endlessly. The hair on my arms stood up. My hands were shaking, holding the flashlight. I told myself to stay calm, logical, rational. There had to be an explanation. Maybe someone was playing a prank. Maybe a homeless person had snuck in. Maybe it really was the wind. I edged backward down the aisle, flashlight sweeping slowly, scanning every shadow, every stack of boxes. The whisper came again, faint, almost teasing. "James." It wasn't one voice, not really. It sounded like multiple voices layered together, overlapping. One soft, one rasping, one high and thin, almost childlike. Each calling my name, echoing down the aisle, following me as I stepped backward. I stopped near the end of the row. My flashlight illuminated a small gap between two shelves, a space too narrow for anyone to hide, yet the whispers seemed to come from there. I held my breath, listening. Silence. I slowly exhaled. My hands were trembling. I had been alone, and I still was. But then I realized something. The whispers weren't coming from behind the shelves. They were coming from the shelves themselves, from the gaps between the metal, from the spaces between the boxes. I could feel them in my bones. The warehouse wasn't just empty. It was aware. It remembered. It had taken notice of me. I stepped forward, trying to shine the flashlight deeper into the gap. The shadows seemed to shift, reacting to the light. My name whispered again, louder, more insistent. "James." I jumped back. My heart was racing. I stumbled over a crate and caught myself. The whispers didn't stop. They drifted along the shelves, moving away from me, then circling back, teasing me, beckoning me deeper into the darkness of aisle C. I told myself to leave, to get out, but my legs were frozen. My mind was caught between disbelief and fear. The warehouse had me. It was playing with me, testing me. I slowly edged toward the end of the aisle, flashlight trembling in my hands. The whispers followed, growing softer as if drawing me in. Then suddenly they stopped. Silence. The quiet pressed against me, heavier than before. I could hear my own heartbeat again, loud and irregular, echoing down the metal shelves. I looked around, but there was nothing. Only shadows and boxes, as if the voices had never existed. I finished the rest of my rounds quickly, keeping my flashlight close to the floor, scanning every shelf, every dark corner. Every creak, every distant drip of water made me jump. Every shadow seemed alive. By the time I left the warehouse, the first light of dawn was breaking through the dirty windows. The shadows retreated, and the whispers faded completely. But I knew they would return. Every night in the quiet hours when the building is empty and the shelves are still, the voices wait. They call my name. They watch. They follow. And I am not alone in the warehouse, even though no one should be there. By the third night, I began to notice something that I couldn't ignore. Something subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss. But the longer I worked in the warehouse, the more impossible it became to ignore. The shelves were moving. I remember the first morning I noticed it. I had finished my night shift, stepped outside into the cold dawn air, and returned the following evening. The aisles I had walked so carefully the night before felt different. A stack of boxes that had leaned gently yesterday now protruded slightly into the walkway. Another shelf that had been perfectly aligned was now slightly tilted. At first I thought I had been imagining it. Fatigue, stress, the long hours alone in a vast, silent space. Maybe my memory had betrayed me. But then it kept happening. Every morning after leaving the warehouse, I would make mental notes. Aisle B, boxes leaned to the left. Aisle F, the top row shifted forward. Aisle C, something blocking the gap I always passed through. By the third shift, the changes were impossible to dismiss. I walked the aisles with the flashlight, and it was clear. The shelves had shifted. A narrow path I had used the night before now forced me to step around stacks I had counted hundreds of times. Boxes that had been stacked against the back wall now blocked my passage, creating small dead ends. It was subtle at first. A few inches here, a box nudged there, but the pattern became unmistakable. The warehouse was rearranging itself, slowly, carefully, methodically. I tried to reason with myself. Old buildings settle, metal shifts. Boxes fall slightly when disturbed by wind or vibration. But none of these explanations fit what I was seeing. The changes were too precise. The paths through the aisles became narrower in a way that almost guided me, almost herded me deeper. One night I walked down aisle D. I was methodically counting boxes, recording numbers in my notebook, flashlight illuminating the metal edges of the shelves. I paused at a stack near the center. Something about the alignment of the boxes felt deliberate, like they had been moved with intention. I leaned closer to inspect them. The edges of the cardboard looked clean, not scuffed by machinery or careless hands, and the stack leaned inward slightly, almost as if it were waiting for me to pass. I walked carefully around it, flashlight scanning the row ahead. The aisle felt longer than before. The shadows seemed deeper. I realized with a chill that crept along my spine that the shelves were creating a maze, a labyrinth that I had no choice but to follow. I tried to leave. I turned toward the exit at the far end of the warehouse, but the path I had taken the night before was blocked. A stack of crates now occupied the walkway, forcing me deeper into the interior of the warehouse. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. Calm down. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the janitor had moved boxes. Maybe the shelving units had shifted naturally. But the more I looked, the less plausible those ideas became. The rearrangements were too controlled, too precise, too deliberate. I walked deeper into the warehouse, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The aisles were twisting, turning in ways I didn't remember. Boxes stacked higher, shelves leaning slightly inward. I felt the walls of metal closing in, guiding me, trapping me, almost as if the warehouse itself were alive. The quiet creaks and hums of the building now sounded different. They weren't random. They were intentional. A low metal groan as I stepped past a shelf, a soft shift as a stack leaned ever so slightly toward me. The air pressed against me like a living thing, heavy and expectant. I tried marking my path with chalk, leaving a line on the floor to guide me back. But the line disappeared by the morning, washed away, covered by dust or something else. I couldn't tell. By the fourth night, the maze was more pronounced. The shelves had moved again. Aisles that had been open were now narrow corridors. Dead ends appeared where none had been. Every path seemed to funnel me deeper, toward the center of the warehouse. I began to talk to myself as I moved, whispering my own name to keep my mind anchored. Just keep going, count the boxes, don't get lost. The words sounded foolish in the immense quiet, but they helped, a little. I noticed details I hadn't before. Tiny scratches along the edges of the shelves, scuff marks on the floor that didn't match my boots, faint impressions in the dust. Like something heavy had shifted between the stacks while I wasn't looking. And then something truly impossible. I stopped dead in my tracks near the center of the warehouse. A stack of boxes that had been on the left now blocked the aisle completely. But when I stepped closer, I saw a gap. A narrow passage just wide enough for me, but it wasn't there before. And in that gap, I saw shadows moving against the walls. Not fast, not like a person running. Slow, methodical, moving in sync with the shelves. I swallowed hard and forced myself to step forward. My flashlight illuminated the narrow corridor. The shadows shifted as if acknowledging my presence. I tried to rationalize it. Just my imagination, exhaustion, low light. But the sense of being guided, herded deeper, was undeniable. I pressed on. Each step seemed to echo endlessly, the metal shelving pressing in, the darkness thickening. I felt disoriented. Aisles twisted in impossible ways. The warehouse no longer seemed like a space I had memorized. It had become unfamiliar, hostile, and purposeful. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell. Time stretched strangely in the dark. The shelves moved subtly as I passed, nudging boxes to shift the paths. Dead ends appeared and disappeared. I realized I couldn't rely on memory. I could only follow the corridors the warehouse allowed. I whispered to myself again, trying to stay grounded. Just keep walking, keep counting, keep moving. Then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, metal on metal, behind one of the stacks. My flashlight beam swung toward it. Nothing, just shadows stretching impossibly along the walls. I tried to step forward, but the path ahead seemed longer, narrower, like the shelves themselves had closed in. I felt trapped, yet I couldn't stop. Something deeper in the warehouse was insisting I go further. I realized with growing horror that the building wasn't just rearranging itself. It was learning, watching me, adapting to my movements. The aisles I had taken 100 times were now impossible to traverse. I was trapped in the labyrinth it had created, a maze of metal and dust that shifted whenever I looked away. By the end of the night, I was exhausted, my arms trembling from holding the flashlight. Every row I thought I had memorized led me back to the center. Boxes leaned inward, corridors twisted impossibly, dead ends appeared where none had existed before. I left the warehouse at dawn, shaken and disoriented. The path back to the exit seemed longer than before. The building seemed to sigh behind me as I stepped into the cold morning air. The maze would be waiting for me the next night. Slowly, steadily, the shelves would continue their rearrangement, guiding me, trapping me, watching me. And I knew there would be no way out, not unless I could find the center, where the warehouse had concentrated its attention, and face whatever it had waiting there. The shelves were moving, and I was their prisoner. I had only just started my night shift when I first noticed the elevator. The warehouse was massive, a multi-level structure built decades ago, with layers of metal catwalks, concrete floors, and rows upon rows of shelving stacked high with forgotten inventory. Most of the building had been abandoned for years, and only a few sections were technically in use, though even those were quiet at night. The place smelled of rust, old oil, and dust so thick it coated your lungs with every breath. I was the new security guard covering the night shift. My job was simple, or at least that's what I had been told. Patrol the building, check the locks, record anything unusual, and make sure no one tried to break in. Easy enough, except for one thing I hadn't expected: the freight elevator in the northeast corner. It was old, ancient even. The kind of elevator that creaked when it moved, with a steel cage and a sliding metal gate that groaned like it was alive. Maintenance logs said it had been decommissioned years ago. The power to it had been cut. No one used it. It shouldn't even be able to move. Yet there it was. The first time I noticed it, I was walking along the second-floor catwalk, flashlight sweeping the shadows. A soft clank echoed from below. I stopped. The sound repeated, metallic and hollow. My stomach tightened. It didn't take long for me to realize what I was hearing: the elevator. I froze in place, trying to convince myself it was impossible. Old metal groans from temperature changes, or the wind, or maybe a mouse inside the cables. I told myself those things, repeated them over and over. But as I listened, I could hear the cage moving, the chain rattling, faint squeals of metal rubbing against metal, rising and falling. I took a cautious step closer to the railing and looked down. The elevator shaft yawned beneath me, black and deep. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The cage was at the ground floor. Then it moved. Slowly, methodically, like it was carrying a weight, creaking all the way up to the second floor, exactly where I was standing. I stepped back, heart pounding. The manual said the elevator should be locked in place. No power, no movement. And yet, here it was, rising as if guided by some unseen hand. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps someone had restored power temporarily. Maybe a maintenance worker had come in. But the night security office hadn't issued any alerts. There were no other guards on site, and I knew for a fact the elevator hadn't been in operation for years. I watched it reach my level. The metal gate slid open slowly, a soft scraping echoing up the shaft. I could hear it, almost like a whisper, carried through the hollow steel of the elevator. I gripped the railing tighter. My flashlight flickered as if shivering with me. I told myself to leave, walk away, do not investigate, but curiosity or fear or something in between anchored me to the spot. Eventually, the elevator creaked to a stop at my floor. Silence fell, heavy and unnatural. The doors didn't open, nothing moved inside, and yet I felt it there, waiting, watching, a presence in the metal cage, a weight that shouldn't be. I spent the rest of my first night avoiding that corner of the building. Every time I passed the shaft, I could feel the elevator somehow aware of me. A low hum, subtle vibrations through the floor, faint echoes of scraping metal. It made my skin crawl. I couldn't hear a person. I couldn't see anyone. But the elevator seemed alive. By the second night, I knew I had to confront it. I had to understand what was happening. I stood at the railing again, flashlight trembling in my hand, eyes fixed on the empty cage. And then it moved again, slowly, from ground floor to my level, just like before. I noticed something new that time, a faint outline like condensation on the inside of the steel cage. It wasn't clear, but it was shaped vaguely like a person, standing, waiting. I blinked, and it seemed to fade as though it had never been there at all. I couldn't explain it. The elevator was decommissioned. No one could have been inside. And yet every night it moved. Every night it seemed to react to me, appearing and disappearing with the same rhythm, the same intent. I started marking the times, noting every movement, every detail. The elevator never moved when I wasn't present, only when I was nearby, only when I was watching. The timing was perfect, deliberate, almost like it knew my routine, my schedule, my presence. I tried calling the office. No answer. The lines were dead. Even my radio crackled with static whenever I tried. It was as though the building had swallowed my attempts to reach out. Each night the elevator's movements became bolder. Sometimes it stopped mid-shaft, its doors sliding open slowly, letting out that same faint, metallic whisper. Sometimes it rattled violently, chains creaking, as if impatient. And always, I felt something waiting inside, though I could never see it clearly. I began to dread my rounds. I dreaded walking past the shaft. The rest of the warehouse felt almost safe in comparison. Rows of shelves, stacks of boxes, dust and silence. At least they didn't move on their own. The elevator was different. It had purpose. It had awareness. By the fourth night, I found myself standing at the elevator doors longer than usual, flashlight on the cage, waiting. My heart pounded. The metal groaned. Then slowly the elevator rose, reaching my floor, doors sliding open. I took a step back, and that's when I felt it. Not a touch, not a presence I could see, but something pressing against my chest, heavy, like the building itself was pushing me toward the cage. My knees went weak. I forced myself to step away. I didn't stay long that night. I left the area quickly, patrolling the rest of the building with my flashlight scanning every corner, every shadow. The warehouse was quiet, but the weight of that elevator lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake it. The elevator shouldn't have moved. It couldn't move. And yet it did, every night. Always waiting, always watching, always responding. And I realized then, with a chill I would never forget, that it wasn't broken. It wasn't malfunctioning. It was awake. And it was aware of me. By the second night, I was both dreading and anticipating the moment I knew would come. 2:17 a.m. I had started keeping notes, jotting down times and small details in my notebook, trying to make sense of the impossible. The warehouse had its own rhythm, and the elevator was at the center of it. The night had been quiet so far. I patrolled the upper floors as usual, flashlight beam cutting thin paths through the shadows. The smell of dust, old oil and metal filled the air. My steps echoed softly against concrete, every creak of the building amplified in the silence. I had begun to notice how alive the warehouse seemed at night, how it breathed and shifted around me, responding to my presence. Then I checked my watch, 2:15 a.m. I stopped near the elevator shaft, notebook in hand. The cage hung motionless at the second floor landing, silent and still. My heart pounded in anticipation. 2 minutes. 2 minutes until the scheduled movement began. I tried to focus on the mundane, counting cracks in the floor, looking at labels on boxes, but my mind kept returning to the elevator. Exactly 2:17, the metal cage shuddered. A low, subtle groan echoed through the shaft. The chains rattled softly, a sound like fingernails on steel. The doors remained closed, but the elevator was moving, slowly, deliberately, descending to the basement. I could feel it through the floor. Not vibrations of a normal machine, but something heavier, deliberate, a presence more than a mechanism. I held my flashlight tighter, knuckles white, and stared at the cage as it disappeared into the shaft below. No sound from inside, no figures visible. And yet, I had the overwhelming sense that something, or someone, was riding in that cage. Not a person I could see, but a weight, a presence that seemed to occupy the elevator entirely. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a maintenance worker, someone who had a key, but that made no sense. The basement was off limits, the elevator decommissioned. No one should have access, and even if someone did, why always 2:17? I stepped closer, pressing my ear to the steel wall of the shaft. The sound of the chains, the cage sliding against the guide rails, was faint but distinct. Then a softer sound reached me beneath the mechanical noises. A breath, slow, deep, deliberate, not mine, not mechanical. Something breathing in the dark in the abandoned basement, rising and falling with the movement of the cage. I stumbled back. My flashlight shook in my hands. I wanted to look away, to convince myself it wasn't real, but I couldn't. My curiosity, my fear, my need to understand had me rooted in place. The elevator reached the basement level with a final metallic sigh. The doors did not open. No light shone. No figure emerged. And yet I knew it had passengers. Invisible, intangible, but real. I could feel the air shift, heavy and cold, as though the basement itself had exhaled in response. I waited, counting silently in my mind. Then the cage began its ascent, moving upward slowly, quietly, until it returned to the second floor. I exhaled, shaking. The doors slid open with a soft metallic scrape. Empty, absolutely empty. But I knew. I knew it carried something down into the dark, unseen depths every night at precisely 2:17. I tried to occupy myself with other tasks, patrolling the upper floors, checking doors and windows, counting boxes, anything to distract from the sense of dread that lingered around the elevator. But the thought of that empty ride to the basement gnawed at my mind. Who or what was riding it? Why the precise time? Why the basement? Over the next nights, I started watching more carefully. I noticed small things. A faint vibration in the metal rail just before 2:17. A draft rising up the shaft, cold and unnatural, carrying with it a metallic scent I couldn't place. Shadows that moved oddly along the walls as the cage descended. Sometimes I swore I heard whispers, soft and unintelligible, coming up from the basement, carried through the shaft. They weren't words exactly, just murmurs, like a chorus of voices breathing together in the darkness. And always, I felt that unseen weight in the cage, the sensation of being watched, of something alive riding alongside me even as I stayed safely above. I tried speaking to the elevator, foolish as it sounds. "Who's there?" I whispered one night, voice trembling. Nothing but silence in return. But the next night at exactly 2:17, the cage's descent felt heavier, slower, more deliberate, as if it had heard me and had considered my presence. I began keeping a record of the basement beneath the elevator. Old blueprints, maintenance logs, employee notes, anything I could find. The basement had been used for storage, then abandoned decades ago. No one was supposed to go there. Yet the elevator continued its nightly journey, perfectly timed, precisely at 2:17. One night, as I watched from the second floor railing, flashlight trembling in my grip, I noticed something else. Faint markings on the cage floor. Tiny scratches like someone or something had been packing inside. And though I couldn't see it, I could feel the presence moving along with the cage, stepping, circling, packing as it descended into the basement. I backed away, heart racing, mind spinning with questions I didn't want answers to. The elevator wasn't just broken or haunted, it was inhabited, occupied by something unseen, something that followed a schedule only it knew, something patient, deliberate, watching from below. I tried to sleep during the day, tried to convince myself it was a trick of fatigue, stress, imagination. But at 2:17 every night, the building reminded me that it was real. The cage would move. The basement would wait. And I would feel that invisible passenger riding alongside me, descending into the dark, every night without fail. By the end of my shift, I realized one terrifying fact. I could watch. I could document. I could record. But I could never stop it. Whatever was riding that elevator, whatever inhabited the basement, would continue its journey. And I was powerless to intervene, powerless to stop it, and powerless to see it. The freight elevator should have been dead, decommissioned, silent forever. But it was. And I was beginning to understand that some things in the warehouse never sleep. I had been working the night shift for a few weeks when I first noticed it. The elevator, which had been descending and ascending on its own schedule every night at exactly 2:17, seemed to be acting differently. It wasn't just stopping at the known floors anymore. One night, it descended past the basement level. I checked my watch as the cage moved, my heart thumping in the unnatural silence. The descent didn't stop where it should have. It continued. sliding down into darkness that wasn't on any map, that wasn't listed on any blueprint. I leaned over the railing, flashlight trembling in my hand, peering into the elevator shaft. Below the basement, where I expected nothing but concrete and old, sealed storage, the cage stopped with a soft, metallic sigh. Its doors slid open. And there it was, a floor that wasn't on the map. I froze. I could see the dim outline of a level beneath the official basement, faint shadows flickering as if the space was breathing. My mind raced. No building records mentioned a sub-basement. Maintenance logs, employee manuals, blueprints, all the documentation I had painstakingly collected, listed only the ground floor, first floor, second floor, and the basement. Nothing more. Yet here it was, existing below the floor that should have been the bottom. A hidden layer beneath the warehouse, silent and waiting. I didn't step inside immediately. I stood at the edge of the open doors, flashlight cutting through the blackness, trying to convince myself it was an illusion. Perhaps a shaft extension, some old construction anomaly, but it felt deliberate. The space was real, solid. The elevator had carried me here with intention. I stepped in cautiously, the metal cage squeaking under my weight. The air was colder here, damp and metallic, carrying a faint smell of rust mixed with something I couldn't identify. A faint, almost sweet odor, like something decaying slowly, lingering in the corners. The floor beneath the elevator was concrete, cracked and worn, with stains that looked ancient. Shadows pooled around the edges, shifting slightly as I moved. I tried to keep my breathing calm, slow. My flashlight beam bounced along the walls, revealing narrow corridors, stacked boxes, and metal shelving that didn't appear on any plans. I started exploring, careful to note every detail. The sub-basement was smaller than the basement above, but it had been organized once. Metal shelves lined the walls, some still holding dust-covered crates. Paper labels faded beyond recognition. Equipment rusted into immobility. It looked like it had been used for storage decades ago and then abandoned, sealed off, erased from memory. And yet the place felt alive. There were subtle indications that I wasn't the first to be here since it was abandoned. Tiny scratches along the walls, marks in the dust, depressions on the floor as though something had walked or shifted along the shelves. Not recent, but not ancient either. Something, or someone, had been here, moving through the sub-basement without leaving a trace on the surface world. I traced a narrow corridor along the back of the floor. My flashlight caught a thin streak on the wall, a smear of something dark, not quite rust, not quite dirt. I stepped closer to examine it. The texture was faintly sticky, almost organic, yet dry. My skin prickled. I knew instinctively to move carefully. Whatever had been here had been aware, and somehow I had arrived at its mercy. I explored further, following the low hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It wasn't electrical. There were no wires, no active machinery. Just a soft vibration through the concrete, almost imperceptible at first, but growing stronger as I walked deeper into the sub-basement. The air was heavier here, the temperature lower. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I swore I saw movement in the shadows at the edge of the beam. Not a shape I could recognize, just a darkness that seemed to separate from the rest of the room, like it was watching, calculating. I held my breath. The shadows didn't move when I looked directly at them. They shifted only in my peripheral vision, almost as if they were aware I was observing. I reached what appeared to be the far end of the floor. An open doorway led to another narrow passage, but it was blocked by fallen debris, rusted metal grates, broken crates. I crouched, squeezing through the gap. On the other side, the space opened slightly, revealing a pit or drop I could not illuminate fully. The elevator cage had stopped just above it, suspended over a hollow void that seemed bottomless in the dim light. I didn't dare step closer. My instinct screamed at me to retreat, to leave immediately. And yet, I couldn't stop. Something was pulling me further into the sub-basement. The warehouse itself seemed to be urging me onward, as if it wanted me to see, to witness, to acknowledge this hidden space. I started noticing small details that made my skin crawl. Faint markings on the walls, almost like symbols, etched carefully into the concrete. Not letters, not numbers, just scratches in patterns I couldn't comprehend. Some appeared geometric, others jagged, like someone had scratched them desperately, trying to communicate something in silence. I pressed on, flashlight illuminating narrow corridors that twisted unnaturally, as though the architecture itself had changed. Nothing in the warehouse plans accounted for these pathways. They weren't random, they were deliberate design. And I realized then that the subbasement was more than storage. It was a hidden layer of the building with a purpose I could not understand. The shadows grew thicker as I walked. My breathing sounded loud in the oppressive silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving with me, just beyond the edge of the light, following, waiting. The low hum beneath the floor seemed to respond to my steps, vibrating in rhythm with my heartbeat. I stopped to examine a stack of crates near the back wall. One was slightly ajar, its contents obscured by darkness. I leaned closer, curiosity battling fear. Inside, I could see old machinery parts, broken tools, and traces of something else. Faint stains along the metal, darkened and dried, not easily identifiable. I recoiled instinctively, my stomach twisting. I had stepped into a space forgotten by the world, and yet someone, or something, had been here, leaving traces of its presence behind. The realization hit me. The elevator had led me here deliberately. It hadn't malfunctioned. It had chosen me, guided me to this hidden floor. And whatever existed here, the shadows, the markings, the hum, the weight in the air, was aware of my presence, watching me, waiting. I forced myself to take notes, documenting every corridor, every shadow, every marking I could see. But the warehouse seemed to resist. Corridors twisted in ways that made no sense. Aisles appeared and disappeared depending on my angle. My flashlight flickered more frequently, and the hum beneath the floor grew louder as I advanced. I realized that time had begun to stretch. I couldn't tell how long I had been in the subbasement. Hours, perhaps, or minutes. I had lost all sense of time. Everything above, the basement, the floors I knew, seemed impossibly far away. I was deeper in the warehouse than I had ever been, further than anyone should have gone. Eventually, exhaustion forced me back to the elevator. My hands were trembling as I pressed the button for the ascent. The cage groaned, chains rattling, and I felt the subtle resistance of something unseen moving with me. I held my breath the entire ride, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the doors, willing them to open. When I finally emerged on the second floor, the familiar hum of the main warehouse greeted me. The shadows receded. The elevator doors slid shut behind me with a metallic sigh, and I knew the subbasement was still there, waiting, silent, hidden, patient. I made my rounds that night in a daze, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. But I knew better. I had been to a floor that shouldn't exist, a hidden layer beneath the basement, and the elevator had taken me there on purpose. Somewhere in the warehouse, the subbasement waits, unseen, unlisted, untouched by ordinary eyes. And I know with an unsettling certainty that it's not empty. Something lives there, something deliberate, something that is aware of me. And it will wait for me to return. It was one of those nights when the air in the warehouse felt thicker than usual, the kind of oppressive silence that presses against your ears and fills every corner with expectation. I had come to dread too, 17, the time the elevator descended to the basement, carrying its unseen passenger, and now I was beginning to realize that it wasn't always alone. That night I made my rounds early, flashlight beam cutting a pale line across the concrete floor. The building was quiet, eerily quiet, the hum of the night almost absent. Even the shadows seemed to hesitate. I had checked the elevator just moments before 2:17, and everything appeared normal. The cage still at the second floor, doors closed, chains silent. I waited, notebook in hand, counting the seconds. The clock on my wrist ticked closer. 2 minutes, then 1, and suddenly the cage shuddered. A low metallic groan resonated through the shaft, followed by the familiar, deliberate movement as the elevator began its descent. But something was different this time. The doors didn't close completely. A small gap remained, like a breathing mouth opening slowly in the darkness. I squinted, shining my flashlight into the narrow gap, and froze. Something was standing in the elevator. I couldn't make out details, just a dark shape, vaguely humanoid, standing still as if it had always been there. It wasn't the weight I had felt in the cage before, the unseen passenger of the basement ride. This was solid, a presence that had taken form, and it was aware. I swallowed hard. My heart was hammering. The instinct to retreat fought against the inexplicable pull to watch, to understand. The figure shifted, imperceptibly at first, a slow adjustment of weight, a subtle tilt of the shoulders. And then it moved. One step, then another. The cage, already descending, seemed to hum with the figure's motion. Each step it took was deliberate, measured, echoing faintly in the hollow metal of the elevator shaft. I realized I could hear it, not in the conventional sense, not like footsteps on concrete, but inside the vibration of the cage, a low thrum that resonated through my bones. I couldn't look away. My flashlight trembled in my hands, casting long, flickering shadows. The figure advanced slowly toward the open elevator doors, not hurrying, not urgent, just moving with the certainty of something that knew exactly what it was doing. I tried to speak. Who's there?" my voice barely carried. There was no reply, only the sound of deliberate movement, closer, closer. The elevator stopped at the basement floor, doors still partially open, and the figure paused as if acknowledging the threshold. A cold gust of air swept through the shaft, carrying the faint scent of something old, metallic, damp, and faintly sweet. My stomach twisted. I wanted to step back, to leave. But I was rooted in place. The warehouse had become a trap, and I was caught in the center of it, unable to move until I understood what waited inside the cage. The figure took another step forward. My flashlight caught a glint, a reflective surface that might have been an eye or just the metal of the elevator reflecting light. It didn't rush. It didn't hesitate. It moved with the patience of something that had waited decades for me to notice. I remembered the sub-basement, the hidden floor below the basement that shouldn't exist. The elevator had carried me there before, and I had felt the weight of that unseen presence riding alongside me. Now, it had chosen to reveal itself. Another step. The elevator creaked under its weight, the chains rattling faintly. I realized the figure's movements were synchronized with the cage, as if it was both inside and controlling the elevator at the same time. My hands shook. The notebook in my pocket fell to the floor with a soft thud. I tried to focus on the details to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was dark, featureless in the dim light, but its outline was unmistakably human. Broad shoulders, long arms, a presence that filled the elevator cage entirely. It advanced slowly, deliberately, stopping at the edge of the doors. And then it paused. For a long, unbearable moment, it simply stood there, silent, immobile. I could feel its awareness, the weight of attention pressing down on me. Every instinct screamed to run, but my body refused. I was trapped by fascination and fear, watching something that shouldn't exist move through a space that had been sealed off for decades. Finally, the figure stepped closer, one foot then the other, sliding over the threshold of the elevator. It moved into the basement, disappearing into the darkness beyond the doors. The faint hum of the elevator changed, almost as if the cage was empty again, though I knew it was. Something had followed it down. I stood frozen, flashlight trembling, listening to the metallic echo of its steps fading into the basement. The doors remained partially open, swinging slightly, catching the dim light from my flashlight. The warehouse felt impossibly quiet again, but the air had changed. The sub-basement, the elevator, the shadows, all of it now felt alive in a way I could no longer ignore. I took a step back, trying to steady myself, heart pounding. My mind raced with questions I had no answers for. Who or what was riding the elevator? Why did it choose 217? Why had it revealed itself now, moving slowly, deliberately into the darkness? I realized with an unsettling certainty that I was no longer just an observer. The warehouse had chosen me. The elevator had chosen me. And whatever had revealed itself tonight had been waiting for this moment, patient for weeks, months, or even years. I made my rounds that night with a hollow feeling, a dread that I couldn't shake. The elevator door stayed open longer than usual, the shadows around the shaft lingering like a memory that refused to fade. I didn't know if I would ever be able to leave the building without looking back, without imagining that dark figure stepping silently behind me. When I finally returned to the security office, I found my notebook still on the floor, pages open to the notes I had written earlier. They seemed insignificant now, trivial observations compared to what I had just witnessed. The elevator had a purpose beyond documentation, beyond movement. It was a carrier, a guide, and possibly something far more sinister. And I understood then that this warehouse, this elevator, this hidden darkness was not just a building. It was alive in its own way, patient, observant, and aware of every footstep I took. I didn't know what the figure was, and I didn't want to. But I knew one thing. It had noticed me. It had stepped into the basement, into a space that should have been empty. And it would wait there in the shadows until the next night, until 2:17, when the elevator would move again, and it would ride once more into the darkness I was forbidden to enter. I stayed awake the rest of the night, unable to shake the feeling of that presence, the memory of its slow, deliberate steps, and the realization that the warehouse had secrets far older and far more dangerous than any guard's patrol could hope to uncover. And when morning finally came, I knew that the elevator would not rest. It never rested, and neither would whatever moved inside it. I had taken the maintenance job because it paid well, and I figured it would be quiet. The warehouse had been abandoned for years, sitting on the edge of the river like a hulking ghost. Its windows were dark, cracked, and smeared with decades of dust. The metal siding rattled softly when the wind came off the water, a constant, low whisper that set my nerves on edge as soon as I stepped inside. The first few nights were uneventful. I went about my work, repairing broken railings, checking the rusted supports along the catwalks, replacing wiring that someone had left frayed and exposed. I kept the small flashlight strapped to my belt, letting it beam across the surfaces I couldn't see clearly, illuminating peeling paint and deep shadows. Everything seemed straightforward, until the night I noticed him. I was halfway across the main floor, replacing a corroded beam near the warehouse's center, when a chill ran down my spine. It was subtle at first, just a shiver that made me glance upward, almost dismissing it as the cold air blowing through the broken windows. But then I saw him. He was standing on the metal catwalk above, arms at his sides, completely still. At first I thought I was imagining him, maybe a shadow, a trick of the low light bouncing off the river. But no, there he was, unmistakable. A man, though I couldn't make out much detail. His features were obscured by shadow, his posture rigid, and yet he seemed almost impossibly calm, as though he had been waiting for me. I froze. My hands gripped the wrench I had been using, knuckles whitening. My mind raced. The catwalk was meant to be deserted. No one had a reason to be here. Security had long since abandoned the property, and there were signs everywhere that the warehouse was off limits. Yet here he was, standing above me, silent and watching. I called out softly, my voice hoarse in the echoing space. "Hello, who's up there?" No response, just the faint creak of metal under his weight. I considered climbing the scaffolding to reach him, but instinct held me back. Something about his presence wasn't right. It wasn't menacing, exactly, but it carried a weight, a deliberate stillness that made my stomach knot. I couldn't see his face, yet I felt certain he was looking at me, studying me, the way someone would examine a puzzle they were slowly unraveling. The river beyond the warehouse reflected a faint glimmer of moonlight, shining through the broken windows and casting pale streaks along the floor. I focused on that light, using it to steady my shaking hands. The man didn't move. He didn't even shift his weight noticeably. He simply watched, silent and patient, as if he had always belonged to this warehouse. I tried to distract myself, pretending he wasn't there. My work needed finishing. I had wiring to patch, handrails to secure, but my eyes kept drifting upward. Every time I glanced at the catwalk, he remained in the same position. Time seemed to stretch, and each second felt longer than the last. Eventually, I decided to approach him slowly, cautiously, making sure my footsteps on the concrete floor were soft but deliberate. I wanted to see if he would move, react, acknowledge me. My flashlight flickered slightly as I shined it toward him, the beam trembling in my hand. He didn't move. Closer now, I could see the outline of his head, the way it tilted ever so slightly as if listening. The closer I got, the colder the air became. My breath fogged in front of me. There was a faint metallic tang in the atmosphere, something like rust or iron or perhaps blood. I wasn't sure. My ears picked up the soft dripping of water somewhere above, the groan of old beams settling, but through it all, he remained perfectly still. I stopped a few feet from the ladder that would take me to the catwalk. My flashlight caught a glint of something on the metal platform above, perhaps a handrail, perhaps the edge of a jacket. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply waited. I remember thinking that whatever he wasn't alive in the conventional sense. Not like me, not like anyone I had ever seen. There was an unnatural quality to him, a quiet certainty that made me feel exposed, as though I had stumbled into a space I wasn't meant to see. I debated my next move: climb the ladder and confront him, walk away and ignore the figure. I wanted to convince myself it was a former worker, a trespasser, someone with a reason to be here. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations made sense. The warehouse had been empty for years. Security was long gone. And yet he was here, unaccounted for, unmoving, a fixture in the dark. I took a careful step back and then another. My flashlight beam wandered across the catwalk, searching for any movement, but he remained rigid. I realized I couldn't see his face, not even with the light directly on him. Shadows swallowed his features entirely, leaving only the outline of a man standing in the darkness. The warehouse seemed to respond to my fear. The wind rattled the broken windows harder, sending papers and debris skittering across the floor. My own footsteps echoed like thunder, but above, the catwalk remained silent. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted. A subtle tilt of his head, the slightest movement of a shoulder. It was enough to make my pulse spike. I couldn't tell what he intended, if he meant harm or simply observation. But it didn't matter. The presence itself was overwhelming. It pressed against me, an invisible force that made every instinct scream to leave. I decided to retreat. Slowly, carefully, I backed away from the ladder, keeping my flashlight trained on him. Every step I took, he remained on the catwalk, unmoving yet aware, following my motion with some unseen perception. The moment I thought I had put enough distance between us, I glanced back, and for a second I swore he had tilted slightly forward, leaning, watching me with intent. I finished my shift in a daze, moving mechanically through my tasks, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. But the feeling lingered, the weight of his gaze, the unnatural stillness, the certainty that I had been observed from above. I kept glancing up at the catwalk, expecting to see him gone, but he never moved from his position, not until I left. When I stepped out into the night air, the river reflecting pale moonlight, I looked back once more. The warehouse sat in silence, metal siding rattling softly with the wind, and I knew he was still up there, somewhere along the catwalk, waiting for the next person foolish enough to enter the building. Even now, when I think about that night, I can feel the weight of those silent eyes, the stillness that wasn't still, the presence that refused to leave. The warehouse had a guardian, or perhaps a prisoner, I don't know which, standing above, watching, waiting. And I have a feeling that the next time I walk beneath that metal catwalk, I won't be alone again. I came back the next night trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, a shadow, maybe even exhaustion after long days of work. But the moment I stepped inside the warehouse, the cold, damp air hit me, and I felt it again. The weight of that unseen presence, heavier this time, almost pressing down on my shoulders. I kept my flashlight close, letting its beam skim across the broken concrete floor and the metal catwalks above. I moved slowly, deliberately, each step echoing in the vast emptiness. My ears strained for any sound, but all I could hear was the wind through the cracks, the drip of water from a leaky roof, and the faint creak of old metal. Then I looked up. He was there, standing on the catwalk exactly where I had seen him the night before. Arms at his sides, shoulders rigid, posture unnervingly still. I blinked, certain I had imagined him leaving at some point, yet there he was. He hadn't moved a fraction, not a tilt of his head, not a shift of weight, just standing, watching. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was a trespasser, hiding here for some reason. But the warehouse had been empty for years, and the rusted ladders and narrow catwalks would have made it impossible for anyone to reach that spot unnoticed. And if he had been human, surely he would have left at least once when I entered. Yet he hadn't. I kept working, forcing my hands to steady the tools, to tighten the railings and replace corroded bolts. But my eyes couldn't stay away from him. Every time I glanced upward, he remained unmoving, observing me with that impossible stillness. I felt my chest tighten. There was something wrong about this, something beyond human comprehension. Hours passed. The moon rose higher, sending slivers of pale light through the shattered windows. I tried counting the minutes to distract myself, to measure how long he had been there. 2 hours, 3. I lost track. Every glance upward confirmed the same horrifying truth. He never moved. Not a muscle, not a blink, just watching. I attempted conversation again, my voice cracking in the vast, empty space. Are you real?" I asked softly, almost whispering. The echo returned, stretching across the concrete floor, but he didn't respond. There was no sound from him, no movement. Just that perfect stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight. The warehouse itself seemed to adjust to his presence. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching across the floor in shapes that didn't belong. The metal catwalks above groaned softly, though the wind was still. Every sound seemed amplified, resonating with his silent observation. I felt trapped in a web of quiet tension, each thread tightening around me, leaving me exposed. I remembered the stories I had heard about the building. Once, decades ago, the riverfront warehouse had been alive with workers, with forklifts and cranes and the constant shuffle of cargo. Now it was a husk, decayed and abandoned. Yet here he was, a figure that belonged neither to the past nor the present, a silent sentinel that refused to leave. I forced myself to keep working, forcing my mind to ignore him, but I couldn't. Every tool I picked up felt heavy, weighed down by the oppressive atmosphere. I felt watched in a way I had never experienced. It was not fear exactly. It was the understanding that I had stumbled into something that didn't belong to me, something older and far more patient than any human being. Hours passed like minutes, and still he did not move. I tried leaving the flashlight on him to keep him in view while I worked, but even in the dim beam, his form seemed to blur, almost blending with the shadows. My eyes burned from staring, yet I couldn't stop. There was something magnetic about his presence, a pull that made me both terrified and unable to leave. I realized I hadn't eaten, hadn't taken a drink, hadn't even noticed the cold settling into my bones. Time was a strange thing here. The warehouse was a place where the usual rules didn't apply. Outside, the world might have moved on, but inside, this figure existed beyond time, endlessly patient, unmoving, always observing. Eventually, I stopped working entirely, sitting on a low beam and staring upward, unable to tear my eyes from him. I tried to understand why he remained, why he didn't move, why he didn't acknowledge me. But the harder I tried, the more I realized some things weren't meant to be understood. Some presences simply exist, and we are fools to think we can explain them. The wind shifted outside, rattling the windows, and I thought I saw a slight motion, just a flicker, barely perceptible. But it was enough to make my heart jump. My mind wanted to see more, to catch a mistake, a clue that would explain this impossible figure, but there was nothing. The catwalk was empty of human movement, and yet the weight of him remained. I stayed there for the rest of the night, working sporadically, glancing upward, feeling his presence press against me. Each creak of metal, each drip of water felt amplified, as if the warehouse itself were alive and sharing his awareness. I felt I was being tested, observed in silence, judged by some standard I could not comprehend. When morning finally approached, the first light of dawn spilling pale over the river, I dared to climb the ladders and inspect the catwalk. It was empty. No one was there. The shadows had shifted with the sun, and the space above looked deserted, ordinary. But I knew the truth. He hadn't left. He simply waited, retreating into the edges of my perception, into the corners of the warehouse where shadow and metal met. Even as I packed up my tools and left the building, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That figure, impossibly still, would return tonight, standing in the same place, watching the floor below, patient and eternal. And I knew deep down that it didn't matter how often I came or left. The warehouse had a guardian, or perhaps a warden, and I had only begun to notice it. Walking away, I could feel the shadow of him lingering in my mind, pressing against my thoughts, reminding me that some presences are not fleeting. Some wait, some watch, and some never move, no matter how long the night stretches, no matter how the world outside continues on. I didn't sleep well that day. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow took shape. Every breeze carried the weight of that stillness with it. And when night fell and I returned, I knew he would be there, exactly where I had seen him, patient, silent, immovable, the figure that never moves. And I realized with a sinking certainty that I might never truly leave the warehouse again, not while he remains above, watching, waiting, unblinking and eternal. I had always assumed that history was something you could leave behind, that the past belonged to newspapers, photographs, and fading memories. But that night, as I sat in the small office of the riverfront warehouse, I realized that some histories never truly vanish. They linger, they wait, and sometimes they watch. I had been thinking about the figure on the catwalk for days. His stillness, the patient way he lingered in the shadows, it didn't make sense. No one could stay there for hours without moving. And yet, night after night, he remained exactly where I had first seen him, arms at his sides, shoulders rigid, eyes, or at least where I assumed his eyes were, fixed on the floor below. I wanted to understand. I wanted answers. That evening, I dug through old archives online and at the local library. It wasn't much, just scattered reports from decades ago, yellowed and brittle with age. And then I found it. A small, almost overlooked news article tucked into a riverfront edition, dated nearly 40 years earlier. A worker had fallen from the catwalk. The article was sparse, clinical even. It described the man as a long-time employee, respected and diligent, who had apparently lost his footing while inspecting the metal railings above the warehouse floor. He had plunged several meters to the concrete below, and despite attempts at rescue, he died at the scene. The catwalk had been repaired and reinforced, but the space was rarely used afterward. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. My eyes wandered to the window behind me, to the river beyond, and for a moment I could almost see the warehouse as it had been then. Bustling with workers, crates stacked to the rafters, the constant hum of machinery. And somewhere above, on that same catwalk, he had stood. I returned to the warehouse that night with the article in my pocket, as though carrying a piece of his story might make him feel more real, more human. I worked in silence, the flashlight illuminating my path along the worn concrete floors and metal supports. And then I looked up. He was there, exactly where the article said he had fallen, Arms at his sides, shoulders rigid, posture unnervingly still. Time had passed for me, and yet here he was, frozen in a moment from decades before. I felt a wave of vertigo, a sense of disbelief that made my stomach churn. How could someone, anything, remain like that, bound to the echoes of a single instant? I climbed the ladder cautiously, trying not to make any sudden noise. My flashlight beam danced over the metal beams, reflecting off rusted bolts and peeling paint. Each step made a small creak, and I imagined the catwalk above shifting under some unseen weight, but he did not move. I reached the top and froze. The cold metal pressed under my boots, the darkness thick around me, and there he was, unmoving, patient, unblinking. The air seemed heavier here, saturated with something I couldn't name. Grief, maybe, or loss, or perhaps the simple inertia of a life cut short. I tried to speak, to break the silence. "I know what happened here," I whispered, voice trembling. "You fell, I know." "Nothing." It was then I noticed the small details I had missed before. The way the shadows on the beam seemed thicker near him, the faint outline of where light refused to touch, as though the air itself bent around his presence. I shivered. There was a truth here I could not comprehend. The man from the article, the worker who had died decades ago, somehow lingered, tethered to the catwalk, watching the floor below as he had that final day. I thought about the fall, how sudden it must have been. One misstep, one moment of imbalance, and everything ended. Yet here he was, suspended in that moment, living it endlessly, over and over. I felt a chill in my bones, realizing that the figure I had feared was not malevolent in the way I expected. He was simply trapped, caught between life and death, shadow and reality, forced to replay the moment of his death in silence. I moved slowly along the catwalk, keeping my distance, afraid that any sudden motion might provoke him. But as I walked, I could feel the history of the place pressing down on me. The weight of decades, the echoes of footsteps long gone, the whispers of voices I would never hear again. It was all anchored to him, the figure on the catwalk, a living memory of a death that had never fully left this place. The night stretched on. My flashlight beam traced the metal railings, the beams, the dark corners of the warehouse, and each time I looked at him, he was unchanged. I felt a strange kinship, a sorrowful empathy, as if understanding that he was not a threat but a reminder. A reminder that the past is never truly gone, that the echoes of tragedy can linger, and that some presences are bound not by intention but by circumstance. Hours passed like minutes. I found myself speaking softly, telling him what I knew, telling him his story. "It wasn't your fault," I whispered. "You were careful. You were good at your job." My voice trembled, carried across the empty warehouse, but he did not respond. Still, I felt as if he listened. The night's air grew colder, mist curling along the concrete floor. I could see my breath in front of me, and somewhere deep in the warehouse, a faint metallic groan sounded, like the structure itself was exhaling. I felt eyes on me, not in a threatening way, but in the patient, eternal observation of someone who had nowhere else to be. When dawn finally began to seep through the broken windows, I climbed down the ladder and stepped back onto the floor. The figure remained on the catwalk, unchanged, unmoving, tethered to a past that no longer existed except in memory and shadow. I felt both fear and awe, a trembling respect for something I could not explain, something that defied logic and time itself. Even as I left the warehouse, carrying the weight of that knowledge, I knew that he would remain. Night after night, he would return to his post on the catwalk, watching, silent and still, forever suspended in the instant of his fall. And I understood then that some deaths are not final. They linger in the spaces we abandon, in the shadows we ignore, in the echoes of our own fear. I cannot say I returned the next night without hesitation. The warehouse called to me, the catwalk above waiting, a silent witness to the fall that had already happened. And though I feared it, though my heart raced and my hands shook, I knew I would return. Because now I was part of the story, a living witness to a past that refused to die. And as I approached that place, flashlight in hand, I cannot help but glance upward every time, every night, to see him standing there, waiting, never moving, a silent testament to the fragility of life and the persistence of memory. It was my last night on the job, and the weight of it pressed down on me in a way I hadn't expected. 20 years of night shifts had taught me to be calm, to keep my mind alert and my body steady, but tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a quiet that seemed thicker than usual, as though the warehouses themselves were holding their breath. I pulled on my jacket, the one I'd worn through countless nights of solitude, and grabbed my flashlight. The streets were empty, the hum of distant traffic just a whisper in the background, nothing like the days when forklifts and trucks filled these industrial blocks with noise. Tonight, it was silence that ruled, and silence has a way of amplifying everything you don't want to notice. The first warehouse was close by, a hulking concrete structure with rusted metal doors and cracked windows. I had walked these halls hundreds of times, but tonight the shadows seemed longer, the corners darker. The moonlight barely penetrated the high windows, leaving pools of darkness that made the familiar unfamiliar. I passed through the main entrance, the echo of my boots on the cracked floor ringing in the emptiness. I started my usual rounds, checking doors, counting aisles, inspecting corners. I didn't expect anything unusual, but as I moved deeper into the building, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a sensation I had grown used to over the years, but one that had never felt so intense. The second warehouse was across the street, older, more decrepit, the paint peeling and the loading docks sagging under years of neglect. I shined my flashlight across the empty yard, noting the way shadows shifted under the high fences. Every step I took sounded like a statement, a claim that I was here, and yet somehow, I felt like I was intruding on something far older than myself. As I entered, the air smelled different, musty, like wet cardboard and rusted metal, with a hint of something else I couldn't identify. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and began my rounds. The echo of my steps was deafening in the stillness. I checked the offices first, all empty and dark, save for the faint yellow light of a lamp that had long since burned out. It flickered in the corner of my eye, teasing me, making me question whether I had really seen it, or if it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. I moved methodically, aisle by aisle, shelves towering above me like silent sentinels. I passed old crates, broken pallets, and the remnants of a life that had vanished long before I started. My flashlight caught something out of the corner of my eye, an old cart, tipped over, metal wheels slightly rusted, but it looked as if it had been moved recently. My stomach tightened, but I reminded myself that I was alone, that wind drafts could tip a cart, that shadows could lie. I shook my head and continued. By the third warehouse, I felt a subtle shift in the air. The building was quieter, heavier, almost oppressive. My flashlight beam caught a high catwalk spanning the length of the hall, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. A figure, a shadow. My heart jumped, but when I blinked there was nothing. Just the empty walkway, steel beams gleaming faintly in the light. I tried to laugh at myself, muttering, "Last night, just get through it." But the words felt hollow in the emptiness. I continued my patrols, moving from building to building, feeling the weight of every empty room. There were no sounds of life, only echoes of my own steps, the soft creak of rusting metal and the occasional drip of water from leaky roofs. The silence was almost suffocating. I remembered nights when I had worked alone, nights when strange sounds had made me tense, but tonight it was more than tension. It was a sense of presence, something lingering just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. I stopped at a loading dock in the fourth warehouse. The metal doors were closed, but the air felt colder here. I felt the hairs on my arms rise, the chill running down my spine. I peered into the darkness beyond the dock, imagining the shadows stretching endlessly. For a moment I thought I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the flashlight's glow just beyond the crates. I froze, breath caught in my chest. I held perfectly still, straining to hear, and then it was gone. Nothing moved. The dock was empty, silent. But the feeling lingered, that unshakable awareness that I was not alone, that something was watching me from the dark. I shook my head and tried to focus on the task at hand. Finish the rounds, record the check-ins, go home. That's all. But every step I took seemed heavier, every echo of my boots louder. The buildings were empty, yet the air was charged with something unseen, something patient. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it in any ordinary sense, but I felt it pressing against me, brushing past my mind in whispers I couldn't understand. As I approached the fifth warehouse, the largest of them all, I noticed the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air. It wasn't recent, more like the memory of smoke, as if the building itself remembered fire and decay. The doors groaned as I pushed them open, and the darkness inside seemed almost liquid, thick and slow. My flashlight beam cut through it, illuminating stacked pallets and old machinery, but every time I moved, the shadows seemed to shift in ways I hadn't noticed before. I walked the aisles slowly, meticulously. I passed broken windows, exposed wiring, and puddles reflecting my light in distorted shapes. Every sense was heightened. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the blood rushing in my ears. The silence made me aware of every detail. The way the metal railing shivered when I leaned on it, the subtle sway of an old chain from the ceiling, the creak of rusted hinges in the distance. I paused on the catwalk above the main floor. The rails were cold under my hands, slick with years of neglect. I leaned over and looked down, imagining the distance, thinking about the years of work this building had once seen, the hands that had moved crates, driven forklifts, loaded and unloaded cargo. And then, for a split second, I thought I saw a figure moving across the far corner, a shadow passing between columns. My heart leapt, but the moment was gone, leaving only the empty warehouse and the echo of my own breath. I finished the final round, ticking off my checklist mechanically, noting the locked doors, the empty offices, the silent machinery. My flashlight grew dim, the batteries fatting, and I felt a strange relief at the thought of leaving. 20 years of night shifts, of walking through these empty spaces, and finally this would be the last. I could go home, put this life behind me, and sleep without the constant feeling of being watched. But even as I stepped out into the cold night air, I could feel the weight of the warehouses behind me, the long shadows stretching into the distance, holding onto something I could not see. I walked toward my car slowly, turning back once, twice, 3 times, and each time I felt the silent gaze of the empty buildings following me. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself it was fatigue, imagination, the mind playing tricks after decades of solitude. But deep down, I knew the truth. These warehouses were more than concrete and steel. They were repositories of memory, of presence, of things that refused to leave. And though this was my last night, I understood with a cold certainty that some of what lingered in those empty halls would remain long after I was gone, waiting, patient, silent. I had walked these streets for years, patrolling every abandoned warehouse in the district, memorizing the cracks in the concrete, the angles of loading docks, the way shadows pooled in the corners at night. I knew every building, every hallway, every echo of empty space. Or at least I thought I did. That night on my final patrol, everything felt different. The air was heavier, as though the wind itself was resisting movement. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar shapes of brick and steel, dumpsters and rusted gates, and yet something in the shadows felt alive. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the last shift talking, my imagination sharpening at the edge of exhaustion. I had almost finished my rounds. Only 1 block remained, the edge of the industrial district where the warehouses gave way to the riverbank. The moon hung low, pale and wan, casting its silver light over the cracked pavement. That's when I saw it, a warehouse. I stopped cold. I knew these streets. I had walked here hundreds, maybe thousands of nights. I had maps, plans, records of every building, and yet this one wasn't there yesterday, or last week, or any day I could recall. It was a hulking shadow against the night, larger than any of the surrounding structures, with steel doors dark as oil and windows that didn't reflect the moonlight but swallowed it. I took a cautious step forward, my boots clicking softly against the asphalt. There were no signs, no markings, nothing to indicate what this building was or how it had appeared. I checked my maps again, squinting under the flashlight. No record, nothing in the city archives. It simply wasn't there. And yet there it stood, waiting. I hesitated at the entrance. The metal doors were locked, but the padlock was old, rusted, hanging loosely as if no one had bothered to secure it in years. My flashlight illuminated the flat concrete yard in front, littered with broken pallets and debris. The building felt wrong, not just because it wasn't on any map, but because it radiated a presence. Heavy, expectant, patient. Something inside was waiting. I could feel it in the air, in the way the shadows bent at the edges of my vision. I pushed the doors open. They creaked, a long, slow sound that echoed through the darkness. Inside, the warehouse was immense, far larger than the structures I knew in this district. The ceiling rose like a blackened sky, and the aisles stretched endlessly, stacked with crates and machinery that seemed impossibly old, yet not decayed, as if preserved in some unnatural state. I moved cautiously down the first aisle, my flashlight beam sweeping over metal shelves and wooden crates. The air was cold, musty, and carried a faint metallic tang, the kind that clings to your nostrils and reminds you of blood. I told myself it was just rust, damp decay. But even as I said it, I felt the weight of eyes on me. Something unseen, watching, waiting. Every aisle I passed seemed identical, yet subtly different. The stacks shifted slightly, the shadows pooling in unfamiliar ways. I turned a corner and froze. A crate had moved, not just tipped, not just fallen over. It had slid a few inches to the side, as if nudged by an invisible hand. My heart thumped in my chest. I told myself it was gravity, vibration, something mundane, but I knew it was. I continued, each step slower than the last. The warehouse stretched on, unending, a maze that didn't belong in reality. My flashlight caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between the aisles. But when I turned, nothing was there. Only darkness, only silence, only the faint echo of my own breath and the soft thump of my boots. I reached the center of the warehouse, and that's when I saw it. A shape, tall and still, standing at the far end of the aisle. My stomach clenched. I could make out nothing in detail, just a human silhouette, darker than the darkness around it. And yet I felt it looking at me, patient, unblinking, a presence that seemed to draw the air out of the room. I called out softly, "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast emptiness. Nothing. The figure didn't move. It didn't even breathe, at least not visibly. I took a tentative step forward, and it felt like the space between us thickened, pressing down, a weight that was not physical but real all the same. I tried to reason with myself. Perhaps it was a reflection, a trick of the light. Perhaps someone else had sneaked in, though who would enter a warehouse that didn't exist? The questions tumbled in my mind, but none offered comfort. All I could feel was the sense of being watched, the knowledge that I had stumbled into something that belonged to another order, another time, another reality. I edged forward slowly. Each footstep sounded unnaturally loud, echoing through the vast interior. The figure remained unmoving, unyielding. I could feel its attention, a focus that was impossible to escape, that seemed to reach into the corners of my mind, probing, waiting. I whispered again, though my words felt foolish in the silence. "I don't mean any harm." Still nothing. I moved closer, the air growing colder with each step. I could see now that the figure was not entirely human, its proportions slightly off, too elongated, too rigid, yet it had the stance of a man standing quietly, waiting. The thought that it might be alive and aware sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to retreat, wanted to run, but something rooted me in place. Curiosity, fear, fascination, they all tangled in my chest. My flashlight flickered. I cursed it under my breath, shaking it to keep the beam steady. When the light returned, the figure had moved. Just slightly, but enough to make the shadows shift in ways that made my stomach twist. It was closer, yet I had not heard a sound. No footsteps, no shuffling, nothing to indicate motion. Just a shift in presence, a sliding weight of darkness. I stumbled backward, heart racing. The aisles around me seemed to rearrange themselves subtly, shelves tilting, crates shifting, creating paths I hadn't seen before. The building itself felt alive, watching me, guiding me, testing me. The figure remained at the far end of the aisle, patient, waiting. And I understood in that instant that I had wandered into a place not meant to exist in the normal world, a warehouse that slipped between reality and something else entirely. I tried to leave. I turned toward the exit, but the door was gone, or perhaps it had never been there. The aisle stretched endlessly, shadows pooling in corners, darkness curling like smoke around my ankles. Panic threatened, but I forced myself to breathe, slow and steady, reminding myself that I was a night guard, trained to observe, to stay calm. I spoke aloud again. I'm just leaving, I'm leaving. My voice felt weak, swallowed by the building itself. And then I saw it, not the figure, but something darker behind it, something that belonged neither to shadow nor to light. I could not make it out, only feel it, pressing, patient, aware of me in a way that made the hair on my arms stand straight. The air grew thick, the cold seeping into my bones. I stumbled through the aisles, every corner revealing the same endless rows of crates, the same darkness, the same waiting. I could not see the exit, could not hear anything other than my own breath and heartbeat. And yet I knew, with a certainty that made my chest tighten, that I was not alone, that something had been waiting for me here all along. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, I could not tell. Time seemed to warp in that place. I stumbled into a small open area and caught my reflection in a broken pane of glass. My face was pale, eyes wide, sweat beading on my forehead. I realized then that I had been talking to myself the entire time, whispering into the emptiness, trying to make the presence less real. But it had been real all along. Finally, I found a shadowed doorway at the far end, one that I could not recall passing before. Desperate, I ran toward it, my flashlight flickering wildly. Beyond it, I glimpsed moonlight spilling onto the asphalt outside. Relief hit me like a physical force. I burst through the doorway, stumbling into the cold night air, gasping, shaking, and finally free. I turned back, wanting a last glimpse of the warehouse, but the street was empty. The lot where it had stood moments before was just cracked asphalt and scattered debris. No building, no shadow, nothing. I walked the remaining blocks slowly, heart still racing, mind still reeling. For all my years of night shifts, for all my training and experience, I had never encountered anything like that. I did not know if it had been a hallucination, a dream, or something far stranger, something that waited in spaces that shouldn't exist, in the cracks between maps and memory, patient, patient, patient. Even now, I know I will never forget it. That warehouse will linger in my mind, its shadow stretching across my thoughts, the figure waiting within, calm, unblinking, eternal. And though it vanished, I cannot shake the sense that it still exists somewhere, waiting for the next person who walks too far, too curious, too alone.